we go. Hi, everybody. This week on Andrew Talks to Awesome People, I'm actually talking to awesome people as opposed to awesome person, as you can see by the screen full of faces. So very quickly, welcome to the Hearing Health Panel. That's what we're calling this, I think. So I would like to introduce everybody, if that's okay. In the upper left, as you look at the screen, is Susan Rogers, who you may know from, I should have looked up the episode number, episode something or other of this show, where we spoke for many, many hours, so you can find out all about her career there. But she most famously was engineer for Prince for many years, basically all the good stuff. There's some other good stuff, but all the good stuff. Left the business in 2000 to pursue an academic career, getting her doctorate in music cognition and psychoacoustics in 2010 at McGill University. And she's now the director of Music Perception and Cognition Laboratory at Berklee School of Music in Boston. I think I got all that right. So that's Susan. Hello, Susan.
Hi, everybody.
Thanks for joining me. Lower right, going clockwise and skipping me, because you don't need to hear about me, is Bella Bathurst, who is an author, a journalist, a photographer, and makes some pretty badass furniture as well, I've got to say, if you go on her website and check that out. Her book, The Lighthouse Stevensons, won the 1999 Somerset Maugham Award. And she's here, first of all, because she's great, but also because she wrote a book in 2017 called Sound, dealing with her 12-year hearing loss episode, which is a very small word for what happened. And she'll be telling us about that. But also, she's been to Antarctica, which is insane. And the photos of that are insane as well. Hi, Bella.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us. And on the lower left, Tchad Blake, who is a Texan living in Wales. And according to the internet, he's won a number of Grammys. That's the official Wikipedia take on how many. And he's a founding member of the Latin Playboys. And he's also fucking awesome. And I'm very glad to count him as a good friend as well. Hi, Chad.
Hey.
So here we are. I feel like I don't want to hog things, but I thought that I would start off with a very brief presentation of how your ears work, and then how that information that comes from your ears gets up into your brain, and a little bit about what your brain does with it. But then there are other people on this call who know way more about it. But I thought it'd be good to just get some background, stuff like that. Then we're going to chat some, and then we're going to have lots and lots of Q&A. And then also we have another guest coming in to talk about some stuff in a little bit. So does anybody have anything they wanted to say up front, or should I just get my boring, inaccurate presentation going?
No, nothing to say from here.
I want to say thanks for opening this conversation, Andrew. As you acknowledged.
Oh, we lost you. Oh no. She'll be back in a second. No.
Back now?
Oh, there she's back. She's back.
You know what I'm gonna do, Andrew? I'm gonna reboot.
Okay.
I'm gonna
You
reboot and
reboot.
then rejoin you. I'll see you in just a few moments.
Okay, you're not going to miss anything that you don't know, but you won't be able to correct my inaccuracies either, but that's all right. Okay.
Sure, it's good. I'll see you in a minute.
Okay, so I am going to just share my screen from a different computer, because this is all very awkward, and I need to make sure that I don't mess things up. So basically, what this is this is a presentation that I originally put together for a class I used to teach at UCLA, and I last taught this class in 2012. So some of this information is slightly out of date, but most of it's right. And I'm going to really go through it quickly and just do the overview, just so people sort of know what we're talking about. Because there are two very distinct parts of the human auditory process. One is the ear itself, which is more of a physiological, mechanical part of the hearing system. And then there is the perception of the sound that we hear that happens up in the brain. So I just wanted to talk about that really quickly. So if we come here, I've got my little pointer thing that's not working, which is great. So you can break up the how we actually perceive sounds into three main areas: the physiological acoustics, the psychoacoustics, and perception. So the first thing in physiological acoustics is that's how the pressure wave that's out in the air, which is sound, is modified by your body, gotten into the ear, converted into electrical impulses, and then gets up to the brain. So that's the physiological part of things. And I'm going to talk mostly about that just to get it out of the way. So also, the ear is ridiculously cool, and Mark's going to share a couple of links to videos that go into much more depth than I'm about to. One of them is by a woman named Wendy Riggs, and she just has a little 2-part video called Special Senses Ear Anatomy, which is very funny and well done and well thought out. And then there's a guy who does this series called Ninja Nerd Lectures, which are insane. And he goes into depth in the physiology and some of the chemical reactions that happen, and it's absolutely fascinating. I'm not going to do that good of a job. So the ear's anatomy has 3 parts: the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. And here's a little picture of it. So on the outside, you've got your pinna and your ear canal that gets to the eardrum. That's the outer ear. Then from the eardrum, which is the tympanic membrane, through the incus, stapes, and we're missing the hammer. There we go. The malleus, the incus, and the stapes. Those are 3 bones in the middle ear that connect the outer ear to the inner ear. And then the inner ear has the snail-looking thing, which is the cochlea, which is where all those hairs are that basically check out what happened outside. And that's how the sound then connects through the auditory nerve up to your brain. So the outer ear is pretty much a passive receiving system that is optimized to collect sound and get it to your eardrum. So you've got the pinna, which is your earlobe, and then all of the other outer ear. And if you look at it, it's got quite a lot of shaping to it. And that has developed over millions of years to help you be able to not only collect sound into the ear canal, but also to help you get information out of the sound, to help you localize, tell how far away things are, what direction they're coming from, things like that. So it's a pretty simple structure that basically is channeling the sound from the outside world down your eardrum to the eardrum, the tympanic membrane. So I've already talked about the pinna. I'm going to skip this. You can download this little PDF thing if you want to check this out. But this is really what helps you get stuff into the eardrum. Then in the ear canal, it's shaped like a tube. So acoustically, it acts like a pipe. So if you're an acoustics nerd at all, you actually have all the same formulas to figure out what note a flute is playing, and you can apply that to the eardrum. So the average diameter is 0.7 centimeters. The length is about 3 centimeters. And then if you really want to do some math, what it shows you is that the resonant frequency of the eardrum is 2,867 hertz, given those dimensions. That is centered around the intelligibility of the human voice. The human ear is mainly trying to hear other humans talk, and it's more broad than that, but that is generally why we're focused in the mid-range, because those are the sounds we're trying to get the most information out of. We'll skip through this, blah, 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 outer ear. Okay, so number 4 in this picture is the inside end of the outer ear, the ear canal. And then if you see 5, 6, and 7, those are the 3 bones that connect the back of the eardrum to what is called the oval window, which is the outside of the inner ear. And it's basically a ridiculously cool mechanical amplifier that takes the information that's coming from the eardrum on the outside through those 3 bones that are different sizes. They're also the 3 smallest bones in the human body, which is pretty badass. They're all in one place doing this thing. So mechanically, the way they hook up will amplify. I'm skipping through this again because you can read this, but oh, come on. Let's just get to it here. Well, actually, no, let's go back here because this is important. So in those 3 bones are in an air gap, basically, between the eardrum and the oval window. And that's because the air inside of the middle ear is at a constant air pressure, which is basically the ambient air pressure in whatever environment you are in. And that means that you get a pressure differential with any sound wave that hits the eardrum. If that was a closed system, then the pressure would not allow the eardrum to actually move freely. And the way you clear when you yawn, if you're on an airplane and your ears start to plug up and you yawn, what you're doing is equalizing the pressure between the room you're in and the middle ear. So it's pretty important, actually. And there's also a lot to do with other parts of the way you sense the world in the ear, not just hearing. But the point is that these three bones in the middle ear give you a 22 times increase in the, it's not in the amplitude, because we're going from acoustic pressure to a mechanical wave and then transferring that into a mechanical wave in fluid. So it's not as easy as just an amplification, but basically 22 times the power of the acoustic waveform is transferred into the fluid that's inside of the inner ear. So then if you get to the inner ear, which is on the right here, and you remember we still have our bones in the middle of the middle ear, that will move the oval window, which is the input to the inner ear, in an analog of the way the eardrum moved from the acoustic wave that's come in. So we've basically just taken the acoustic wave, stuck something in front of it, just like a microphone diaphragm. That moves, but then instead of creating a voltage like microphones do, it leaves it as a mechanical wave, but transfers it into a pressure wave in fluid that's inside the inner ear. Now, that's ridiculously cool, but the inner ear is absolutely insane. And I highly, highly recommend watching the Ninja Nerd lecture because it goes into a lot of depth on this. I'm going to go very quickly through this. So inside the inner ear is the cochlea, and it has three tubes running inside of it. And the one that we're most concerned with really is the one that contains the basilar membrane, because that has the infamous hairs that everybody's heard about. You got a bunch of thousands of hairs inside your ear, and basically they're different sizes and they're in different spots in the basilar membrane. And on a very basic level, each hair is responsible for a different frequency. It's not quite as simple as that, and there are other feedback things that can change what frequency the hairs are sensitive to. But basically, what you've got is the oval window moves, so you've got a pressure wave inside the cochlea, and that will excite a certain region of this basilar membrane. So if you unrolled the snail-looking thing, you'd have this nice long membrane with a bunch of hairs sticking up on it. And depending on the frequency, because of the stiffness and the size of things and what's going on inside the inner ear, a different part of the basilar membrane will be excited by different frequencies, which will move the membrane up and down, which will change the structure of the hair cell as the fluid is moving above it. And I can see Susan cringing a little bit. So it's not quite right, but it's sort of kind of right. And the only thing you need to know about this is you get this pressure wave that goes through, exciting different parts of the basilar membrane. As those hair cells that are in that part of the membrane get excited, they send signals up to the brain, which we'll go into in a little bit more in the middle. The high frequencies are the closest to the oval window where it comes in. And then when it gets to the end, there's actually another window that helps to dissipate the energy in that wave, whatever hasn't been used up by the basilar membrane, so you don't end up with weird standing waves inside the inner ear. So the wave really travels once through and then out, and that's it. I've talked about that right now. I just want to get to one thing. So I just mentioned that each hair is connected to a particular nerve in the auditory nerve bundle, which transmits electrical impulses up to the brain. But this picture I got from Susan, which is just, this is so ridiculously awesome. Okay, so this is one of the inner hairs, which is communicating up to the brain, the inner hair cell. So it is sitting above the basilar membrane, which is the little yellow thing. Then you've got the hair, which has what looks like fingers on top. As the wave travels past that hair, if that hair is excited by the basilar membrane moving, you can see in the middle picture that the fingers of it get pushed to one side, which physically opens channels in that hair cell, the membrane, which allows positively charged calcium, I'm sorry, is it calcium that goes in? Potassium, sorry. Calcium comes out the other one, but potassium goes in, which positively charges, which raises the potential of that hair cell. And so what you can see on the bottom is that when the hair is resting, there is a resting potential. So it's not like nothing ever happens until that hair is excited. There's stuff coming out saying, I'm here, I'm cool, there's nothing going on. When it gets pushed to the right, it opens up the channels and there is more activity going up to the brain. When it is drawn to the left, where it can be damped down to actually close channels, when it's inhibited, and this is one of the really cool things, and it's a very important thing to understand about the way your ear works, is certain frequencies can actually be inhibited to try and save things. When noises are very loud, there's feedback from the brain back down to the inner ear to change the way that it will respond to certain sound waves as they get into the inner ear. So it's almost like thinking about when you've got a waveform, you've got 0 volts and you go above and below. And this is the same sort of thing where you have this sort of ambient amount of information being brought up to the brain. And then you've got the, hey, I'm excited by what's going on. And then you've got the, okay, I'm going to be inhibited to not transfer too much information because there's something else that's going on in the auditory system. I'm going to stop sharing the screen because I will get myself into trouble if I go too much further with this. So I'm going to look over here and get rid of that. So when it gets up to the brain is when all the really crazy stuff happens, which is amazing. So up to this point, you can think of your ear like it's a microphone. Sound comes to it, and it turns that sound into something else, and the something else is impulses that go up the auditory nerve to the brain. The brain actually has quite a bit of control over the physical structure of the inner ear, and it's why if you're ever at a concert and it's really, really loud, and then you decide to plug your ears, you'll notice the pitch of the concert actually changes when you do it. And it's because in real time, your brain has actually stiffened up the inner ear to try and protect it from being modulated too much by the high sound levels that are coming in. So it's not as simple as your ears just kind of hanging out, reacting to what's coming in. There's a lot of feedback back and forth, which brings us to ringing in the ears when you actually have damage with the ears, because it will test the circuit coming back. But well, I'll let people smarter than me talk about that. But as the impulses get up to the brain, they actually go off in 2 different directions. So one of the very first stops they make is into more of the primitive brain structure that's shared by all things with the brain, which says, do I need to react to this sound? Am I about to die? Should I run? And that is not done by the 5-level auditory cortex that says, hey man, that sounds a little bit like a chainsaw coming close. That's done by the part of the brain that's been around even before mammals existed, because mammals are the only ones with the really wrinkly bit that's the cortex that does all the decision making and cool stuff that happens with mammals. Then once... well, both happen at the same time. But if there's no like, holy shit, I'm going to die reaction, then that part of the brain is like, cool, whatever. I heard it. I don't need to care about it. Then you get to the part of the auditory cortex, which is like the microphone preamp in that all the information coming from the ear is plugged in and it gets all of that information and starts to assemble it. But then what the cortex does, and this happens with every sensory input, so this is with sight, sound, taste, hearing, touch, is it starts to try and assemble this information that comes in into patterns. And it tries to figure out if it's something that it needs to pay attention to. So there are layers that come. So the very first layer starts to organize the sound into little packets and try and figure out, well, that's some spoken word. Oh, that's music. Oh, that's background fan noise. Don't need to worry about that. And we'll start to filter things out. And then whatever it thinks is important will be sent up the chain to the next level, which organizes things into larger structures. And then when you finally get up to level 5, if it's important, your brain says, hey, by the way, you should listen to this. Kinda. I want to read 2 very short quotes from books, and then I promise I'm going to shut up. So the first one is from a book called On Intelligence by Jeff Hawkins, who is an incredibly smart man. He's the guy who invented the Palm Pilot, so the graffiti handwriting system for the machine learning and artificial intelligence. He's really smart, and he's got another book coming out in a couple of weeks, which looks like it's going to be amazing. So what I wanted to read here was this. So he says at one point, take hearing. When someone speaks to you, the changes in sound pressure occur very rapidly. The patterns entering the primary auditory area, called A1, change just as rapidly. Yet if we could poke a probe higher up into your auditory stream, we would find invariant cells that respond to words, or even in some cases, phrases. Your auditory cortex might have a group of cells that fire when you hear thank you, and another group of cells that fire for the phrase good morning. Such cells would stay active for the whole length of an utterance, assuming that you recognize the phrase. So the point of this is that your brain is constantly looking for patterns, trying to predict the future so it knows what's going on, uses the least amount of energy possible, and it will actually make structures to deal with things that happen often. There's an amazing study where in the, I guess it would have been the early 90s, there were lots of people who had a single neuron that would fire whenever they saw Bill Clinton. Because he was so prevalent, especially after the impeachment trial, that the brain's like, okay, we know that dude, you're the one who tells us when it's Bill Clinton. I don't need to figure that out anymore. So people would have one neuron in their visual cortex that would go, yeah, it's Bill Clinton again. And then after he came out of office, that neuron gets repurposed and goes off and does other stuff. Another thing, I just want to really quickly, oh, there it is. So auditory scene analysis. This book is really incredible. It's pretty intense. There's a lot of scholarly work that I don't begin to understand, but he says in the foreword, if you just want to get the concept, read the first chapter and the last chapter and skip all of the scholarly stuff in between. That's basically what I've done. But if you think about the fact that your brain is organizing into things it can recognize, like different words and phrases and sounds, so you can recognize different instruments within an orchestra and stuff like that, the idea of the pattern recognition goes towards things like you will recognize a song even if it's in a key that you've never heard it in, or played on an instrument that you've never heard it in. You'll recognize a melody even if it's sung in a different language, which is exactly the same thing as being able to read a book even if it's in a font that you've never seen before. That's because your brain is organizing into overarching patterns, not looking at exactly where every dot on the page is. But then there is this other thing, which is there's so much sound coming in of everything that's going on. How does your brain break it up into what are does what's called scene analysis to break it up into things that go together and things that don't go together? And one of the examples is when a mother is singing a lullaby to their child, the child recognizes the lullaby but doesn't notice the squeaking of the rocking chair. That's been happening the entire time they've heard the lullaby. So just to give you a so here's a description of what auditory scene analysis is. So imagine you're on the edge of a lake and a friend challenges you to play a game. So the game is this: your friend digs two narrow channels up from the side of the lake. So this is like your ear canal. Each is a few feet long and a few inches wide, and they're spaced a few feet apart. Halfway up each one, your friend stretches a handkerchief and fastens it to the sides of the channel. As the waves reach the side of the lake, they travel up the channel and cause the two handkerchiefs to go into motion. You're allowed to look only at the handkerchiefs and from their motions, answer a series of questions. How many boats are there on the lake and where are they? Which is the most powerful one? Which one's closest? And is the wind blowing? And has any large object been dropped suddenly into the lake? Now, if you think of that as a visual exercise, watching just the little ripples coming up these channels, that seems absolutely insane, but that is exactly what your auditory system is doing at all times. So the reason I wanted to say all this is because if you go get your hearing tested, like I did about 6 weeks ago, you'll find out that perhaps something's wrong. Like in my right ear, I've got a big dip at 6.5K. That has very little to do with your ability to work on music, make records, mix records, have conversations, be with people, go to concerts, because that is just a measurement of a little bit of the raw data collection that might be a problem, but there is so much more to the hearing system that can overcome these things and work around them and make them insignificant to the point of them not even really necessarily existing. And scene. So I'm going to shut up now. And perhaps, I don't know if Susan wants to sort of make any corrections to anything I've said and then expound a little bit on some things. And I'm going to have a sip of coffee and shut up.
Good one.
Thank you. That was wonderful. So if I may, let me just clarify a few things. That was very good, Andrew, but early in the talk, you talked about hairs. Then a little bit later on, you described them as hair cells. So let me correct something. You mentioned 25,000 to 30,000 hairs or hair cells inside the inner ear. That's not quite correct. So what we have in the inner ear, sitting atop the basilar membrane, is a single row of inner hair cells. And you can think of those as our A to D converters. So an inner hair cell is sitting there, and it's so named because it has stereocilia at the top of the cell, which look like little hairs. And the hairs are connected by little springs called tip links. So we got a single row of 3,500 inner hair cells, our A to D converters. They're taking the analog motion of the basilar membrane, pushing them up and down. And when the basilar membrane pushes them up and down, the little hairs go dink, 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 dink. If you're listening to a 1 kilohertz sine wave, that little guy's going back and forth 1,000 times a second. One phase of the wave, the little hairs are pushing together. On the next phase, the next cycle of the wave, the little hairs pull apart thanks to the tip links that are connecting them. I know this all sounds like voodoo, and it's so amazing. So together, apart. And that is what encodes frequency, up to about 4K. After that, they can't fire fast enough. They have to use another system, but doesn't matter. What's happening is you showed that diagram, and at the base of the diagram, at the base of the hair cell, that's actually not the basilar membrane. Oh. That's an auditory nerve.
Okay.
And each inner hair cell has, in human beings, 10 to 20. I've read 6 to 10, but more recently I read 10 to 20 auditory nerves sitting there waiting to catch the neurotransmitters that are released into the gap. And when they catch those neurotransmitters, and when there's enough firing happening to cross their threshold, they fire. And so you get analog motion becomes a digital nerve spike, which, if you spread that out across the 30,000 auditory nerves that we've got on each side coming out of each cochlea, the distribution of nerve firing patterns is going to be able to tell us that's a record by Lil Baby and that's a record by Cardi B. That there will be a distinct neural firing pattern across 30,000 neurons to represent everything you've ever heard in your life. Then the signal that's coming down from the brain originates in the auditory midbrain, and it's coming down, and it goes to something even more amazing. It comes down, goes into the cochlea, and innervates roughly 12,500 outer hair cells. So we got a single row of our A to D converters, but we've got anywhere from triple to quintuple row of our outer hair cells. Those are our D to A converters. Those are the ones that take as their input the distributed nerve spike activity. And those little things are like the battery in your active direct box. They're little cochlear amplifiers, and they can push in a certain region of the basilar membrane, or they can pull down and clamp down to allow you to hone in on what you'd like to be listening to and ignore what you don't want to hear. So you're listening to a mix and you want to focus on the vocal. You're subconsciously sending a command down to your outer hair cells, and you're saying, I really don't want to be hearing the drums or the bass the horns or anything else right now. I really just want to focus on this vocal. And the little outer hair cells will be okay. And they'll add energy in the region of the basilar membrane that corresponds to the frequencies of that vocal. So it is a bidirectional path going back and forth. The reason I wanted to put a finer point on it is because if we're talking about hearing damage, we're talking about damage to these little guys, either the inner hair cells or the outer hair cells, sometimes just the hairs themselves, or sometimes even the little springs, the tip links can break. Now, the most common cause of sensory neural hearing loss is actually not even that. It's damage to the nerves themselves. So what happens is inner hair cells release excitatory neurotransmitters like GABA, things like that, excitatory neurotransmitters. And you got your auditory nerve fibers sitting there at the base of the cell, and they're waiting to get their input. You go to a hardcore concert, and I hope you wear earplugs, but if you don't, your poor little hair cells are taking a pounding, and they're releasing all this GABA, this excitatory neurotransmitter, into those poor little auditory nerve fibers. And what happens is the end of the fiber, just like an inner tube that gets too much air, will swell and pop. And eventually the auditory nerve fiber will die. And that's like going from a 24-bit system down to a 16-bit, down to 8-bit, and down to 4-bit, because you're losing resolution in your auditory system when you wipe out those auditory nerve fibers. It's the single biggest cause of age-related and noise-induced hearing loss, is we wipe out those fibers from too much excitatory neurotransmitters. Now, some are going to die with age anyway, but healthy habits, especially ear protection, can help preserve them so that you have a nice high-res system for as long as you can. And one last thing I'd like to put a finer point on. You're absolutely right, Andrew, that cognition, knowledge, influences perception in a big way. Often you hear what you expect to hear, and those of us who have been working with audio professionally in our lives have developed a cognitive profile that allows us to infer what's going on in a lot of cases of missing information, which is why many of us old timers as audio engineers can keep working well into our 50s, 60s, and look at Al Schmidt, even beyond, because cognition is saying, I got this. I know what I should be hearing. I know if these frequencies are present and they're behaving like that, even that stuff I can't hear must be there. So that's important to acknowledge.
Great.
Too.
And of course, that's the basis of lossy audio compression, is that your brain will fill in the gaps of what is taken out in MP3 and AAC encoding, etc.
And that happens with everything. That happens with our vision, memory. So it's really a useful tool, this sort of error correction, isn't it? Kind of a thing or something. That helps us just get through the day, even, and not even being old or having a whole lot wrong. It's happening anyway, right?
Yeah, it's. Sorry, go ahead.
I wanted to say there's one other factor. When we're listening to music, and this is so amazing, the older we get, the more music we've heard. And as you're listening to music, when you're hearing music that you like, that's making you happy, you're releasing dopamine. And you're forming a template right there in your auditory cortex, right above your ears. You're actually shaping your primary auditory cortex to be receptive to sounds that you like. So we get faster and faster at deciding that's the music of me versus not for me. This isn't my kind of music, because you've shaped the receptor, your auditory cortex, to receive music that you like. And dopamine is a big part of that.
Boy, you don't have to get older to do that. My kids do that already.
Yes. Yeah, we start in youth. But an interesting thing that I just found out recently is that dopamine is actually in the inner ear. It works to inhibit excitotoxicity. Dopamine can prevent damage. There have been other studies that have shown that stress, the presence of stress in our body, is way more damaging to our hearing system than the presence of feel-good neurotransmitters. When you're working and you're getting an ear pounding, let's say, but you feel great, it is believed that some of these feel-good neurotransmitters, including dopamine, have a little bit of a prophylactic effect on your hearing system. Not to say that you shouldn't wear hearing protection, you should, but studies have shown, and there's plenty of support for this, not all sound pressure levels are created equal.
I've been wondering why I just love to always have a little shot of mezcal when I'm working.
It's the same thing.
It just really puts me in a great mood, and nothing hurts anymore. It's
exactly.
But yeah, we discussed that one of the studies during our interview a few weeks ago, and it's absolutely fascinating about the difference between factory workers who are exposed to a certain sound pressure level for a certain number of hours per day versus people working in, I don't even know if it was the live sound field, but it was something like that, where they were exposed to the exact same sound pressure levels for the same amount of time, but doing something that they really enjoyed and enjoying the sound they were hearing, and they had less hearing loss, which seems crazy, but it's what I think one of the most important things is to understand how much control your brain has over all of what seem like dumb physical systems that must only react, and they don't. And it's incredible. So, Bella, hello.
Hello.
I was wondering if you might want to talk a little bit about your experience, because of course your hearing loss was very different to the type we've been talking about.
My experience was, well, it looked like sensory neural loss. It looked like flattening the hairs that Susan's just been talking about in the cochlea. It wasn't, because it was misdiagnosed. But long story very short, I had a couple of head injuries in my early 20s, and I started to go deaf fairly soon afterwards. I went to the audiologist who tested them, said, yes, you're losing your hearing, here's some hearing aids, and there you go. And because, as Andrew has just described, the mechanism of the ear is so beautiful, such a piece of jewelry, and so absolutely bound up with and embedded in the brain. When you get to diagnostics, when you get to hearing problems, you can only really do sort of the equivalent of detective work, biological detective work. You can't do a biopsy with hearing. You can't have a look, because if you were to go and have a look, A, the bones are tiny and what you're dealing with is absolutely minute, but B, it would be neurosurgery. You would be operating on your skull, and you really, really don't want to mess with your skull unless you absolutely have to. So basically, in my case, they did a bunch of detective work, and they said, well, from the clues available, we think you've got this sort of hearing loss, off you go. And it was only after 12 years of progressively worsening hearing, and by the end it was down to about kind of 30% of normal hearing in both ears, that I was re-diagnosed, and it was discovered that it was an issue with the middle ear, the three bones that Andrew was describing, the stapes, the malleus and the incus, the stirrup, the anvil and the hammer. The stapes had begun to ossify, so there was a kind of accretion of bone around it. It was just not moving in the way that it should have moved. So it was a mechanical problem, not a nervous problem, not a problem connected with the nerves. So it was something that could be mechanically operated on. So again, long story short, I went to France, and where they pioneered this extraordinary surgery to deal with this particular form of sclerosis, otosclerosis. They take out the knackered bone, and they replace it with a tiny little thing that looks like the top of a question mark in titanium, and then they're like a little hook. And kind of long story short, again, I got my hearing back in both ears. So, I wanted to write about it, not just because it was a story that I didn't think had been really told elsewhere. And there are very, very few books on hearing. There are a lot of books on music. There are a lot of books on the technical aspects of audiology, but there aren't any books on what it's like to be deaf, in the same way that there are thousands of books on kind of what it's like to have cancer and whatever else. So I wrote about it, but and in the course of doing that, I went off to talk to other people who had suffered from something similar, or who worked in the professional kind of whatever. And the two groups that I kept on coming up against were the ones who were most exposed to hearing loss in their profession. It wasn't industry anymore, heavy industry, where you think people are prone to losing their hearings or did in the past. It's the military, lots of loud bangs, and it's music. And I mean, Andrew and Tchad have heard this before, but I went off kind of, because there's lots of stuff online with kind of musicians saying, they support campaigns about tinnitus, or they've signed up to something about kind of hearing loss, or protect your hearing, or wearing earplugs, or kind of whatever it is. So I thought, okay, well, all these different musicians would be great to talk to about. They're in the age bracket, or they're not in the age bracket, but they've said online that they've got some sort of hearing loss. So I'm sure they'll sort of, I can find somebody who would talk to me about this. I tried for 1.5 years, and I have had more luck trying to get people who have basically unconvicted criminals, people who have done stuff that they haven't been charged for, to talk on the record, than I did musicians with hearing loss. It was insane. Nobody would talk about it. It was like total omerta. And I think possibly the guest will talk about this as well. But you get very good, if you're deaf, at spotting other people who are deaf, because of the way they watch your face. If you can't hear, then a lot of your sound input and a lot of your communication cues come visually. And people who are losing their hearings and don't want to admit to it, or even those with hearing aids who are still struggling, do tend to watch you like a dog watches, for the words dinner, basically, or walk. The way a dog kind of just looks at you with that kind of insane level of attention. It's like, did she start as, and I could see, there were plenty of other, I would meet musicians and people who I knew were deaf, but the level of kind of, the level of omerta about it was just mad. And it wasn't, I don't think, until I met Tchad and Andrew that I realized how prevalent it was, and also perhaps some of the more subtle reasons for not just, because that's their sense of it is that it's damaging professionally, but some of the more subtle thinking around it as well. And so over to you.
Well, I wanted to ask one question just about your particular case of the hearing loss. it just seems incredible to me that you would have an ossification of the same single bone in each ear, but it didn't affect anything else. Was there ever any explanation as to why those two bones were attacked in this way? Does anybody have any idea why that was that way? It just seems crazy to me.
I think it is fairly crazy. I don't know. No, I mean, the same thought has occurred to me. I mean, if you have those three little bones and they move in this incredibly subtle and sophisticated way, I mean, like the mechanism in an old-fashioned watch or something. I mean, really, really precise. So why does only one, the stirrup, starts to ossify? How come the anvil and the hammer don't?
Exactly,
I mean,
and the same one in both ears.
Exactly. All I know about it is that it is a genetic condition. It comes more often through the maternal side, and it tends to be sort of onset round about sort of 27, 28, which coincidentally, which is when I had this hearing loss, and coincidentally is also the age when Beethoven started to go deaf. So although Beethoven was kind of retrospectively diagnosed with kind of, you know, virtually every condition in a medical dictionary, it's interesting that one of the things that he did have was otosclerosis, and his hearing started failing at about that age. But why it should be that particular tiny little bone, no idea. I mean, maybe Susan can answer that. But I mean, I guess it wasn't, from my point of view, in some ways, I stopped being interested in the kind of mechanical stuff or the diagnosis or kind of what. All I was really interested in was that I spent this period of time deaf. What did that do to me? What did that do to my understanding of sort of communication? And what a fucking miracle that I got it back.
Well, and because the way you've described it, I mean, the way you describe it now, you were losing your hearing, like, oh, okay, it's harder to hear. But you've described it as it got to the point where what you could hear was so horrible that you would avoid any noise whatsoever, because it was not like you wished you could have heard more, but it was still okay. It was actually a horrible experience just being around sound for a while, right?
It was difficult. I mean, actually, what happens when you go deaf, and I'm sure this is the same for kind of, you know, age-related hearing loss, and is you become obsessed with acoustics. You think that you're just kind of like, the volume goes down and that's going to be it. Actually, all that happens is you get insane kind of about what a room is like, or what a street is like, or kind of what you know, the difference in acoustics on water, or kind of around stone buildings, or kind of, or very echoey offices, or you know, concrete, or kind of whatever it is. So you become acutely sensitized to acoustics, and some environments are much more difficult. So very reverberant places are really difficult, because you've got that bounce back, and as you described, Andrew, normally you have that kind of filtration mechanism. Your brain is processing and filtering, but that goes when you start to lose your hearing. So your poor brain is trying desperately to kind of sort out the kind of stuff that's necessary to hear from the stuff that's unnecessary to hear. And when you've got a very reverberant situation, it's really difficult. Added to which, I then had these operations, and the first one went wrong, and what I was left with was not less sound, it was distortion.
Right.
So it was, I mean, I described it at the time as listening to kind of Brian Eno with one ear underwater.
Which Brian Eno would probably describe as a record he'd like to make.
Well, yes, he'd appreciate that, wouldn't he?
So
that's not such a bad thing, but actually at the time it was really, because distortion, it was just screwed up sound. It was just
Right. Well, and I'd like to, if we can right now, because he's here, I'd like to bring in Giles. Giles Martin is here and I think this will follow on quite well from what you're talking about. And I think, hello, hey Giles. Oh, can't hear you yet.
Hey.
How are you? Oh, can't hear you, Giles. It's that Zoom thing. It's the audio people on Zoom.
Can you hear me if I switch off my...
Yes.
Wait a second, let me try this.
Yep, there you are.
Oh, no, we got you now. Got you now.
Got me now?
Yeah.
For some reason, my AirPods... Oh, who knows?
Who knows?
Working.
You sound good without them.
Yeah, okay, great. Well then. Actually, they're in. Okay, great.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. We've just been talking about things, and one of the things that Bella was just talking about was that in her research on deafness and people with hearing loss, that one of the groups that absolutely refused to talk about it was people in music, which I think brings us right to our core point, the stigma of admitting that there could be anything wrong with your hearing when supposedly hearing is your business. And that's a rather interesting thing.
And it's very prevalent in the industry. And obviously, as people are aware, I grew up with a famous father who was profoundly deaf by the time he died. And he grew as, he started going deaf around about the time in his early 50s. And he believes he became deaf through the abuse he suffered, or the hearing abuse he suffered working with Jeff Beck. He blames the Jeff Beck,
he blames Jeff
Beck albums he does for his deafness. He blames Jeff Beck for his deafness. But he realized he was going deaf when they were lining up a tape machine and they played, I can't remember what the kilohertz they were playing back was. It was 15 kilohertz below that, but he suddenly realized he saw the meters moving and couldn't hear it. And growing up as his son, his deafness or his impending deafness was a huge embarrassment to him, and he hid it from just about everyone he could. And he said to me once that the thing is, Giles, if you're suffering from hearing loss, you're deaf. But if your eyesight starts failing, you're not blind. Which he was very erudite, my dad, and it was a really important point in this, is that the stigma is, if you have suffered any hearing loss, which happens to the majority of us anyway as we get older, there seems to be a black and white thing about this. You can either hear or you can't hear, and there's no pathway in between. I've a lot of people ask me about hearing because for instance, with the company Sonos, I tune their speakers and I sit in a room and I'm basically work as one of their spectrum analyzers. And I'm pretty good, I think, from just the fact that I grew up with a man who I had to hear on behalf of. I'm pretty good at recognizing frequencies. I can pick out frequencies fairly quickly and easily. I can adjust things accordingly. I tuned the one time I tuned a speaker that I had issues with. What I did is I just ran tunes that I knew really well through Pro Tools, EQ'd the tunes so they sounded good on the speaker, and then sent them a graph so they could counteract it. And he measured it in an analog chip. He goes, "It's remarkable. It's the same as our measurements." And I said, "Well, it should be." Now I can do that, but I don't think I've got perfect hearing in any way, and I think my brain is probably adjusted over time to probably the abuse I had playing bass in a dodgy indie band in the 90s and all of the stuff we've done. And I think the stigma that's attached is, no one likes to admit failings. No one likes to, we like to complain we've got a sore knee or anything like that. But when it's our careers, most of the great mix engineers I know who still mix great records have hearing loss. I know we don't talk about it, but I know on the grounds that they'll turn things up and make things louder and just because I grew up with this watching, I got into doing what I do in studios because my father couldn't hear. He dragged me along. I was just like his guide dog, and he would tell me, we'd sit by a piano and he'd tell me what he couldn't hear anymore. And I'd be aware, especially in string arrangements, what he couldn't hear. We'd go to the score and he'd say, this is what I'm, can you listen out for this? Because I can't hear it. And he got to the stage, by the time that he reached the end of his career, he really couldn't hear anything above 1 kilohertz, middle C.
Wow.
On a piano. And we did this test in my room at Abbey Road, in my studio at Abbey Road, and we were playing tones. He wanted to know how deaf he was, we were very close. We were playing, it's probably caused, thanks, Dad, but it was like this, this incredible, this noise we blasted out, and he's just looking and going, there was nothing there.
Wow.
But I remember, but his sense, I remember, I went off and did the Love Show in Vegas, and that was a big sound system, I think 7,000 speakers. And he was 81. He came into the room, and he said, "I think there's too much." And he's funny because I think we have too much 80 hertz going on in this, because that was his hearing range. He could hear, he could still sense, but he could sense the balance that was above it. Interestingly, respectively, you could sense that balance. I think that's the key. We deal with balance all the time. We deal with sound and balance. And I think with the harmonic relationships, which are to do with frequencies and sound, we still manage to understand.
Right. Yeah, because things feel different. And I think the point you made very early on is really interesting. And I think what goes to the core of this is that any amount of hearing loss, you're deaf, as far as other people's perception of it. And that is exactly why I wanted to do this panel, to make people start making people stop thinking that way, because it is obviously a gigantic spectrum between a little bit of hearing loss and not being able to hear. And I think Bella is one of the few people on the planet who's lived through that progression and then been able to come back from it. But it is amazing how much you can fill in, but it's ridiculous how insignificant small amounts of hearing loss are in day-to-day life. I mean, my dip at 6.5K, I've got ringing in both ears that has gotten worse during the pandemic. I think partly because we spend so much time on Zoom. That's my compressed audio theory, but I'm not going to go into that tonight. But but while I'm working, it's not, I don't think about it. I don't notice it. It doesn't affect me. And I don't even have to think about it, because your body adjusts to things that change as they change. I'm fascinated by the idea of you being brought to sessions. And was it that you were brought obviously to help your dad hear things, but was it also that you would have to do it discreetly so no one would even know why you were there? You were just there because you were there.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting. To a lot of people, I was just this spoiled kid. That probably hasn't changed. To a lot of people, I was this, it's bring your son to work day. They couldn't understand why I was there, but it became more. It was. I remember my dad's hearing loss happened before I started doing this, but I mean, he was working with the band Ultravox in Montserrat. I spent a lot of time. I grew up in Montserrat, where he had a studio. He was working with the '80s band Ultravox, and they were a lovely band. They were actually just a lovely bunch of people, and they understood that his hearing wasn't as good as it should have been, because he came out of the studio and the bass player said to him, "How's it going in there, George? Is it going okay?" And my dad held up a plate and said, "2 boiled eggs," and then carried on walking, which is so that the phrase was always two boiled eggs.
Well, if you used a boiled egg rating scale, that just means it's not going that well.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. You're such a great artist. People would have thought you're right. That pretty means something. We'd always have laughs about it. I mean, I remember as a kid, my mum would say the most random things like, "There's a nice green taxi," and my dad would say, "Where's an ice cream factory?" That would be the sort of, there was all of these things. And people would, but me being brought to the studios, I digress. Yeah, it was very, you know, it had to be very diplomatic the way I approached it, because people wouldn't have to, he would just call me over and have a conversation. And because I've got quite a deep voice, he'd always be able to, you know, up until his death, he'd be able to understand what I said. And, you know, I remember actually, funny enough, there was certain people, like we worked on a thing with Pete Townsend, and Pete Townsend knew exactly what was going on.
Well,
and I
death recognizes death.
Yeah. I must have been about, you know, I was in my probably very early 20s then, or maybe 20. And a lot of people just, because he was reliant on me, a lot of people saw it the other way around in a weird way. Like, it's a bad way, but a lot of people sort of, so what you know, we don't want the son to be. We want George Martin. That's what we want. But he was reliant. It was a bit like, you know, when you see someone older and they've got a carer or someone helping them, they go, well, I don't want to talk to them. I want to talk to, you know, they're obviously claim some sort of ownership over the person, which wasn't the case at all, obviously. But yeah, it was a tough thing to do.
But did you ever, were there ever situations where you felt he was making decisions based on, but he would have made a different decision if he could have heard properly? I mean, it doesn't seem as though he needed information, but he was still making records.
Yeah, no, there wasn't. He was acutely aware of the fact he was becoming more disabled, I think is probably the right word. He's a very pragmatic and had a great process to what he did. And he would more question me whether he'd heard something or hadn't heard something, than he would rush in and make a decision based on the fact. He would never make a decision based on what he didn't know. He wouldn't take a punt on stuff.
Right.
Yeah, and a lot of it, you know, it's you know, if you're inherently musical, like he was, a lot of it's in your head anyway, and then you're just trying to get it onto paper or onto magnetic tape and then bits as we know now. And that process was almost checks and balances. You know, he knew the template of what he wanted to get. That's why those Beatles records are so great. You know, you listen to a 4-track of Revolver, everything's there. It's not like, you know, there's a mix going on. Put the faders up and, you know, Taxman happens. That's how they are. Yeah, they have a process of what you're just basically checking the boxes of what you already heard in your head. And if you're not necessarily hearing that, you have to have another checks and balances that goes. He's never wanted to be groping in the dark. That wasn't his style, and that probably helped in his hearing loss. Strange enough,
right?
Because he wasn't trying to listen out for something. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, like Beethoven came up earlier. I mean, you know, the music's in his head and it gets down onto paper. So the same way, you're not only reacting to what you hear to decide what to do next. There is a plan.
Yeah, and that's an interesting. It's a good point with my dad actually, for now, because you know, when we did the Love project, and he really wasn't. You know, he would come in on a Thursday, and I'd play him the stuff, and I'd work on the show, and he really wasn't that involved because of A, the technology, B, because his hearing loss was so bad, and it got to. We wanted to use a demo version of While My Guitar Gently Weeps. The director wanted to use it in the show, but Olivia Harrison and Danny Harrison, Georgia Sun were unhappy with using a demo, not the original. And I said, why don't we get my dad to do a score and we'll get it finished? Why don't we do it so it's a, you know, and I had to get permission from the Beatles to do it. And I phoned up my dad and I went, you know, this is the idea. And he goes, I can't do it. And I said, why can't you do it? He goes, well, I'm not the man I was. I said, but you're the man you were, as you can't hear, but you can write a score. He goes, I haven't written a score in 8 years. And he wrote that people should listen to the love version of Wild Montage. The score he did is brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. And it's incredibly sensitive. And it's very hard to write a score, as if anyone's trying to do it to a demo without a click track and record it without a click track, which he did. All of these things, you know, are very sensitive. You're writing a score around a guitar and vocal with, and it's very clever what he did. And it was all still in his head. It was a great, for both of us, it was a hugely sort of life-affirming moment, even in the end of his life, because it was like, it was someone not being able to walk suddenly doing a 100-meter sprint.
Giles,
in a way.
I'd like to ask, were hearing aids an option for him? Would he consider?
He had hearing aids,
Oh, he had
absolutely.
them. Okay.
Oh yeah, he relied on them completely. And that was one of the tricky things. There was moments, I mean, really early on, he was wearing hearing aids very early on, because his hearing loss happened. He absolutely relied on them. We did a show, I remember he did a talk show, this is where we were having to hide. And we were very aware of not exposing him as a deaf man. And we did a show in France with Antoine de Caunes, who was he still is a famous French broadcaster. And it was one of those things where someone has been made to wear an earpiece, and the questions are asked in French and are translated in English, and as you answer the question. And I just thought, oh, you know, because you have to take his hearing aids out. Take a hearing aid out. And it was so loud, it was feeding back. And then it was live. And I sat in the green room because he can't do anything, and just thought, how's this going to pan out? And it was a total disaster up until a point the first question got asked. And Antoine de Caunes, who was an incredibly lovely man, just switched and have said in French to the audience, I'm so sorry, this is our fault, we have technical problems. I will conduct the interview in English and translate it into French for everyone. And that's what he did. It was like, but it was those things where he wore hearing aids. It was really quite early on. He grew his hair long. If you see photographs of my father, you know, he had long hair for the sort of period of the 80s. You see photographs of him doing Paul McCartney album stuff, and that's because he had hearing aids in both ears.
Wow.
Yeah. But you know, I've met various very big artists. I had the privilege of working with some of them, and you just think, I mean, you just think, oh my Lord, I recognize this. I recognize this, and this loneliness. It's a loneliness that you get from people would say about my dad, he's really deaf, and I go, yeah. I mean, he'd sit at dinner tables with people he'd find him generally quite an attractive lady that made my mum unhappy, and he would write messages to them. And of course, during dinner, you'd see a conversation because he wouldn't be able to hear. And people would say, God, it must be so terrible for your father. You know, he's a man of such music, and now he can't hear music anymore. And I go, he don't hear any music. He wants to hear people talking to him. You know, that's the funny thing. It's like he's heard enough music. The music's probably made him go deaf. What's he missing out is the asides and the wit and the gossip and that fear of going to a cocktail party or a loud room. And you become incredibly aware once you've been with someone like that of acoustics of a room.
Yeah, Bella was talking about that earlier, about just being obsessed with the acoustics of where she was as to how that was going to impact her hearing.
Well, Bella's brilliant. I mean, nice to see you, Bella. But yeah, Bella's a big spirit. It's such a great education for people to see the Benjamin Button side of it in reverse, in a way. You know, it's such a great education to read that.
Do you think it'll ever change? Because it sounded like your father was. It wasn't just that he felt it would impact him professionally. It would have people would lose faith in a deaf record producer or a record producer with hearing loss. It was that he also felt ashamed, and I certainly did. I know, and I know a lot of people with hearing loss who did. It was real shame. Do you think that sort of musician thing? We can't talk about it. We are not going to talk about it. We may talk about it amongst ourselves, but we are not going to talk about it outside that. Is ever likely to shift?
I think there has been a shift. I think there's been a shift to a certain degree, because the industry's got older. So there's more people around that were doing loud music now than there were when my father was going deaf. So that it's become, and I think that people in studios that I know do talk about it, probably amongst their peers and not with the younger generation. I would have thought more.
That's absolutely, that's happening. We were talking a little bit about this earlier, that there's more people talking about it. People that the thing that Andrew and I do every year, or we're doing until the plague, mixed with the masters, we'd always get participants who would say that they didn't think that they were going to make it as a mixing engineer, because, or at least very far, they might be able to do small projects but never get really professional, because they knew that they had some hearing loss. We've ended up talking about it quite a bit, and especially at our pub chats. It's one of the big issues that we try to get into, talking about it and ways to remedy, because it's slightly different, I think, from with the specialization of being a mix engineer, isn't it?
It's funny. My immediate reaction to that, because there's not a conversation I've ever experienced, but my immediate reaction is that's crazy. That's what I said to them. That's crazy.
What's
what do
crazy?
You do? Well, the thought that you wouldn't be able to be a good mix engineer because you've suffered some hearing loss.
Oh yes, I agree.
That was my reaction to them, is like, well, why don't you do some mixes and see if they're any good or not? There's people with perfect hearing that would probably do really bad mixes. There's that. It's that compensation thing. I'm working with Universal on mental diversity. The thing that, I was dyspraxic as a child, and my daughter's dyspraxic, and I was talking to Matthew Vaughan, a film director, and he was very dyslexic. We were at school together, and we believe that our careers have probably been aided by the fact that we think in a slightly different way, perhaps. And it's that thing. It's like, if you hear in a different way, there's no such thing as perfect hearing. There's no such thing as humans doing anything perfectly. And I think that's the key. It's like, well, what's the story that about John Lennon saying to Ringo Starr, make it sound like this, Ringo, and Ringo said, that's two drummers, John. And John Lennon said, well, don't let that stop you. And that's the thing. It's like, well, don't let that stop you. Is the way we should be approaching this to the younger generation. I think awareness of, and here's the other thing, Bella, to your point, is what's happened since my father's time is that it's a bit like smoking. It's that people are aware of what causes hearing loss, and hearing loss does happen. All of these things, it's talked about more where before it's just, you're just old. You're just disabled. You're old. So I think from the people that I sort of train and look after, they're aware of hearing loss, and they're aware that they think they may have suffered it or whatever. And I just go, well, be careful, because what it'll ruin conversation, but it shouldn't ruin your work. Sorry,
and to go a little farther on that too, with what you were saying, is that that's what we end up saying, I think, is that your whatever hearing loss you have is actually going to make your approach to something unique. So you can use that. You don't have to think about it really. Just carry on and lay your ears back and get to work.
And depending on what the hearing loss is, I think like there's a great example of this that just occurred to me from talking to you the other day. So if you have reduced hearing in some frequency range in one side or both sides or something like that, it's not a lot different than going to a different set of speakers. And Chad, you were saying the other day you did a mix on a monitoring system that you hadn't done a mix on before. And you're like, wow, it actually came out, it was good, but it was completely different. And it's just a different way to listen to things. And to say that your hearing part has to be perfect, but you're fine on NS10s is one of the dumbest sentences you could ever say.
Sure. Well, with my particular anomalies, because I have the added thing of having a eustachian tube that just got fried with radiation, and this gives me trouble. Different. I don't know if it's humidity or pressure. changes in the day, changes in the week. So my mixing has changed. I used to do a song or two a day. Now I do, I do 3 songs at the same time over 3 or 4 days, because I want to make sure that my ears change, and there's good days and bad days with my ears, and I can sort of get rid of any buildup of problems from one bad day. And I've also got this ear can often go down in level quite a bit. So I've set up my speakers so I can flop left and right very easily, and make sure balances are. But sometimes I don't like to. It's kind of, why couldn't that be good? That I can hear like the right side a little bit more than the left side, and I'll just mix that way. But over all this time, it seems like I need to do that less and less. And I don't know if that's some of the stuff you were talking about, Susan, how we make up for this in our brain, same that we do with sight, memory. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, it's very true that top-down processing is coming down from the cortex, and it's saying, all right, I recognize that this side is a little bit different from that side. I'm just going to fill in the gaps. And as I said earlier, the longer we live, the better able we are to do that. You've spent so many hours of your life mixing and engineering that your auditory cortex is an old pro. It knows what to do and can compensate for the lack of input. Something I would like to talk about is the new hearing aids and some new therapeutics for hearing loss, because there's some really good stuff. The new hearing aids now, clear plastic, you don't even know you can't see them. It's just clear plastic right there in the just in the pinna, and they're controlled via Bluetooth on your phone. My friend Tommy Jordan, musician, suffered hearing damage in his left ear, and finally he went and got that hearing aid. He said he feels like Superman, that he can control the volume on his phone, and his life has improved so greatly. I can hear it in his speaking voice. He used to talk really loud because he couldn't hear that well. And now he's speaking in an average tone of voice. And it's really important to remember that if you're losing hearing on one side or both sides, your auditory nerve bundle and your cortex are not getting stimulated. So it's like reading in the dark. You've got to turn some lights on. You have to stimulate the sensory organs for them to work as well as they possibly can. So if you're losing your hearing and you're not getting a hearing aid, the auditory nerve bundle is saying, well, I guess hearing isn't very important to this guy. I'm not getting any input, so why bother? Why send any metabolic resources to that part of the system? So you get that hearing aid and you start stimulating the auditory nerve again, and the auditory cortex, presuming that it's there, of course. You start stimulating it and it comes back online, and your hearing will gradually improve over time with those devices.
Your brain is very happy to repurpose things to save energy. Very happy to do it. Well, did you want to talk about some of the other treatments, though, for tinnitus? Because it used to be, if you get hearing loss, it's irreversible, that's it, you're done. And obviously that's not the thinking anymore, right?
Can I ask Giles, did your father have tinnitus as well as hearing loss, severe hearing loss? Or did he complain of tinnitus?
No, he just had hearing loss.
Okay.
Just had hearing loss. But going back to the hearing aid thing, I remember with his case, his hearing loss became so bad that hearing aids would no longer be able to amplify the signal enough so they could hear it.
I wonder if the new hearing aids would have helped.
I don't know. One of the things we know from, especially over the last decade of work, is that in noise-induced hearing loss and age-related hearing loss, the most likely source of the loss is the auditory nerves. As I mentioned earlier with the excitotoxicity, that's going to be the first thing to go. We've got spares, but the resolution is going to get dimmer and dimmer instead of looking at like a high-def image, visual image, you're now looking at a Polaroid, but that's okay. You can still make out what the objects are, but the auditory nerves are the first to go. The second thing that is the second most vulnerable are the hairs on top of the hair cells. And then the third thing that's the most vulnerable is the outer hair cells. When the outer hair cells go, they can't do their job of helping you to differentiate speech from noise. And that's why reverberant environments are really nasty, because the outer hair cells are supposed to let you hone in on the signal you're interested in and just let everything else be noise. But if those are damaged, the noise and the signal all the same. And then the last thing to actually go is the inner hair cells. They're pretty tough little guys. But if the auditory nerve bundle is damaged, having a hearing aid isn't going to help you much, because there's no wires. Call them wires. If your wiring is out, the hearing aid won't help you. One thing I learned about just recently that sounds really cool is the cochlear implants take an electrode and they run an electrode through the cochlea down the basilar membrane, and that electrode stimulates the auditory nerve bundle. The problem with them is that frequency categories are really wide. It's got really poor frequency resolution. So they're pretty good for speech, but they're horrible for music. What researchers are doing now is inserting just a partial cochlear implant in that region between 1K and 8K, focusing right around 4K where we're most vulnerable. And you can have just a partial cochlear implant that helps activate the auditory nerve bundle right in that region where you're starting to lose it, which is this wonderful technology. Incredible.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because as I say, my father lost everything above 1K, and he likened it to a storm running through his ears of sound that have flattened all the hairs like trees in a hurricane. That was the way he imagined it happening, or was described it happening by his audiologist, and it got to the stage where there was nothing, there was no receptors there at all. So that sounds, and I guess what would happen, going back to full circle to our conversation about adaptability and the sort of the way we function, I guess over time your brain will equalize. It's like a crossover in a speaker. It will equalize the crossover point where your cochlear implant and your hearing system, it'll settle, won't it? I have a friend of mine who was deaf from meningitis as a baby, and he recently, at the age of 46, had cochlear implants.
Wow.
Having and he struggled, actually, to be honest with you. He struggled with it because he had 80% hearing loss, and he's now only having to learn to hear again.
And
the auditory cortex, it gets used to not having input, so it says okay, and the nerves that are up there will say, hey, vision, do you need any help, or anybody else need anything, because I don't have any input. But if you do restore the input, it does have to learn, just like if you were a baby, it has to learn to recognize individual timbres and people's speaking voices and how sound behaved. I wanted to ask Bella, because I was very curious about this. So Bella, when your hearing was restored, what were the changes that you noticed in terms of the ability to resolve what it was you were hearing? How did it gradually improve over time?
That's a difficult one, because there was a sort of 12-year, well, actually it was more like kind of 13, 14 years, sort of gap between one and the other. And before, it had just been hearing like, hearing like having two legs, or kind of, it was a thing I took for granted, in the way that everybody takes your perfectly functioning body for granted. And then you lose it, and you're suddenly kind of hyper aware of it, hyper aware of the acoustics, hyper aware of that loss, hyper aware of how that changes your relationships to other people and to the world and to your job and everything else. And then I got it back. So I can't in some ways tell you how it changed my relationship to sound, except that it was suddenly sound with awareness. It's like the kind of, the Zen thing of kind of, first it was the mountain was a mountain, then the mountain was all seeing, all knowing, then the mountain was a mountain again. And then, and it's all I can tell you is that it was just like the biggest, wildest, most extreme thing. I mean, there was a moment when, which I describe in the book, right at the end of going to a classical concert for the first time without audio, without the digital hearing aids in, with kind of newly healing ears, and I know that evening changed my cell structure. Never mind dopamine. It did something to me on a cellular level. It was like the first unfiltered sound that I'd heard in that, and it was a full body experience. It wasn't just so in a sense, what interested me about kind of what happened to sound when I got it back and how I heard it was what we're all so reliant on speech, and we're also reliant on music, and as a kind of in a very sort of mono way, but I got really interested in what it did to all the other parts of your body, not just your ears and your brain, what sound can do to you in a holistic way. I know that sounds sort of slightly hippie-ish and kind of, but I know that experience of going to an unamplified concert and receiving that sound in that way for the first time did something utterly profound to me, and I suspect that that's what people are reaching for all the time when they go to gigs and stand too close to the speakers. It's not just about the kind of beat into your, the echo of a beat, the echo of a heartbeat, and it's not just about conductive or all the stuff that's coming through your bones. It's about something bigger than that, and I can't pin it down, but actually it's cooler because I can't pin it down. If you think that makes sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you had pleasure centers that had been built up over your life until you started losing your hearing based on listening to things you liked, and they must have been pretty happy to like, we're back.
It was like all the lights and all the colors came on simultaneously, and I guess that's sort of that's what you are doing. That's what you are reaching for. That's what the music is, and that feeds in, Tchad, to your work on distortion. Where are the sweet spots? What are we trying to hit, and why does that slight unease when you've got distortion do something nice to us? What's that about?
I wanted to see if Susan knew more about that, because that's just always, I've never really pursued any information on it. I've just always thought, we've talked about this before, that the distortion or sound distortion in nature would be a warning signal for a human, really. I mean, that would be something we would have evolved to pick up on quite easily. It would be, you wouldn't need much of it, but it would mean danger, because of a sound that would distort in nature would either be something so loud, or it would be an animal cracking, I don't know, like a lion roar or something, right? So there must be some really things that really trigger us, right, with distortion. It doesn't take much.
You are the maestro, and I think it's probably safe to say we've all copied you. You're the maestro of distortion. And you taught us how to use it. But there's a couple of circuits in the brain. You got your nucleus accumbens and you got the caudate nucleus, and they're sitting up there in the old ancient lizard part of the brain, and they are involved with reward seeking. And as little children, we've got that reward seeking pathway that's compelling us to try out new things. But then we've also got another pathway that involves some of the same circuits that's saying, don't do it. This could be bad. I don't trust it. So the two things are constantly competing with one another. When we're little children, if we get adventurous and we listen to new music, if we listen to music that the other kids aren't listening to, if we get adventurous and it works out for us, the circuit, the caudate nucleus says, see, I told you that was going to be good. Great. And you will evolve to be, you'll develop to be an adventure-seeking musical lover. Now, for some of us, we might be very, very conservative when it comes to our taste in fashion or food, and very, very adventurous when it comes to our taste in art. But it develops over time based on whether or not we've been rewarded for being adventurous or not. In the case of distortion or of any kind of avant-garde music or sounds that are brand new and mind-blowing to us now, if we are adventurous enough and if we like that sort of thing, certain circuits will say, yeah, give me more of that. And what's really cool is that the decision-making process, when we're listening to music, the decision-making process of deciding like versus dislike happens within 500 milliseconds. Within half a second, we've decided, I like this or not for me. And when we decide not for me, it fires up different neurons and nuclei in the brain. So before we're even consciously aware of it, we are bonding to the music that we like and we are avoiding the music that we don't like. Everything is the way it is because it got that way. And thanks to your great work and the work of many others, we've come to be listeners that enjoy distortion now and regard it as rewarding. We have to hear it first before we can recognize it.
But it's not always the thing that, for me, the thing that so many people get wrong these days with distortion is that it's become quite an overused tool. People like to distort everything, and my view was always that if it's just like colors or anything else. If everything's distorted, then nothing sounds distorted. It's you want a contrast. So if you want something to sound more distorted, put more clear stuff in your mix, and the opposite, and vice versa.
It's the same with, I do a lot of immersive audio work. It's the same thing where people trying to train people up with this Atmos mixing and stuff like that. If you spread everything completely wide or revolve everything around, you have no idea of space. You need something to hold on to.
That's right.
So you can hear separate things. But I mean, but with going back to what you're saying to you, Susan, I guess the concept of distortion and the concept of the levels of, it's only sort of very small evolutionary terms that we've been dealing with sounds that are being magnified, that are this loud on a regular basis. I mean, that's really what's happened to us, is we are all responsible for fabricating noise, if you like. That's noise fabricator is my job. But it's that thing where it's not in the grand scheme of things. But we're not, as humans aren't designed to really listen to what we listen to now.
Mm. Well, yes, I agree with that. But also, for me, the most interesting thing about distortion is not the really overt distortion. Big guitars and loud, and yeah, you can create the sense of loudness with distortion, with an EQ. But what I'm really interested in is more and I've talked to Bella about this, and she's put me in touch with somebody at the Imperial College, and they were gonna, I didn't talk about it, we never got around to it, but can distortion actually help people with some hearing loss? Does it actually trigger something? Because that's what I've always thought, is that even just a little distortion most people wouldn't really hear the distortion in the signal. You could take a clean signal and just add the tiniest bit of, say, quite a rough distortion, but just the tiniest bit. And for me, it seems to perk things up. Now, you might hear the whole mix and say, oh, well, there's no real distortion in there. And I'm talking about the kind of distortion, I don't know how to if there's a word for it, but really audible squaring of waves. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about inaudible squaring of waves mixed in. And
Really
to me, it seems to make you. I always perk up if I just add the littlest bit of distortion into something, and not on everything, but I always feel like that my energy goes up, and I'm drawn to it.
I think it's a really interesting question, and I don't know the answer directly as to whether or not adding distortion would improve perception. But one thing we know is that as soon as a system gets nonlinear, which the auditory system is anyway, but as soon as you add a little bit of clipping, you're adding frequency components that weren't there in the input. And those frequency components could then activate auditory nerves that normally wouldn't be activated. So if you, as soon as you square something off, you're adding more high frequencies that could just overall increase the overall level of activation, or a very, 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 very small level, but still enough to boost the perception maybe a little bit.
Now, you would know something more about this, isn't there? And I don't know what the mechanism is. I've read very little about it, but because we hear such a wide range of levels, of sound pressure levels, and our ears can open up, right? And it's like on the order of millions or something, this amplification system that we have that can take something from an area that we shouldn't be able to hear. And our cochlea actually does the job of amplifying this like minuscule sound pressure level to a place where we can hear it clearly. I mean, if we don't have really severe hearing problems, but that induces its own there's some sort of distortion process in that, isn't there?
Yeah, it's so amazing. So the lowest audible sound pressure change that we can hear is 10 to the minus 12 watts, a picowatt. It's so amazing that a picowatt of air pressure variation can cause your eardrum to go in and out, the bones of the middle ear to go, okay, the oval window to go up and down, the basilar membrane to go up and down, the hair cells are like, okay, I hear that. It's crazy that we can hear that, and we can go to a heavy metal concert and listen at 120 dB SPL and still be able to hear afterward. Yeah, and now you mentioned the distortion in the cochlea. So what happens is when we're hearing a very soft sound, the inner hair cells that I mentioned before, they got the auditory nerves sitting at their base, waiting for some action. And there are 3 different levels of spontaneous firing rate. So you've got your lazy little nerves that don't fire very often, your medium spontaneous firing rate, and then you got your nervous little nerves, the ones whose quiescent firing rate is pretty fast. So as soon as we're listening to a quiet sound, the nervous little nerves are like, oh, and they start giving off action potentials. And then you turn the gain up, and then the medium fibers, they start to fire. Then you turn the gain up even more until you get to about 60, 65 dB SPL. And now even the laziest nerves are firing. To hear above 60, 65 dB SPL, you turn the gain up. Now what has to happen is the basilar membrane starts going up and down at even higher amplitudes, and it spreads. Its mechanical activity spreads to neighboring neurons that are off resonance. They're just the neighbors. They're not getting the action in that frequency band, but if you move them high enough, they'll start to fire. So the louder you crank it up, the ear being a nonlinear system, the more spreading of activity you're going to get up toward the higher frequencies. You're just going to recruit more neurons, and it will be perceptibly louder.
And your brain tells from the pattern to say, well, let's hear that as a louder of the center frequency, not a spread of the frequencies.
Yeah. When the brain, if your whole basilar membrane is being excited, the brain says, this shit is loud, even if it isn't. So if you're EQing a guitar and you've got lows and mids and high frequencies, even if you're listening to it at 50 dB SPL, the perception is going to be that it's loud, because only something that was really massively loud would have that full bandwidth of activity going on.
Well, and talking about what Chad was talking about at the beginning, where the distortion is more of a primitive signal that there is danger. We were wondering, in one of the many times we talked about this, if there's a similar sort of mechanism in the brain that you get when watching a horror movie, which is you're frightened by something, but you know you're in a safe place, so you can enjoy the fear. And if there is something in the auditory system that's the same way, you hear a sound with the distortion, which would normally mean something bad, but you know you're in a safe place when you hear it, and you can actually get pleasure just from that.
Yeah, they say that every sound that we're hearing today is filtered through every sound we've ever heard in the past. So you've learned to recognize that, well, imagine a little toddler who's scared of a balloon or a piñata or something. You're terrified of it. What is this thing? Until you learn that it won't hurt you. Then you're no longer afraid of balloons or piñatas. And the same thing with the sounds that we hear. I love how the late affective neuroscientist Jack Panksepp said, sound is a special form of touch. And the auditory path goes up through the midbrain, and it goes to these nuclei that are, as he said, richly endowed with opiate receptors. So if you're hearing a timbre or a sound that feels good to your body, like what Bella was saying earlier, the whole body can process that sound, and it goes through those nuclei with those opioid receptors. You release things like dopamine, and it feels good. And we learn that certain things feel good or taste good or smell good over the course of our lifetimes.
Wow, so we're really screwing ourselves up with distortion. If something dangerous comes, if something dangerous really does come, we'll be.
But it also, I
mean, that feels good.
Our whole world is distorted. If you eat a cheeseburger, that bread is distorted wheat. It didn't grow like that. Now the tomato is undistorted because it grew like that. The lettuce is undistorted, but the meat, the cheese, the mayonnaise, all distortion. It's not naturally like that. I think we human beings are accustomed to a very unnatural world in large part.
But one of the interesting things about that, the flip side of that, is that everybody I spoke to who had some form of hearing loss, or it didn't matter whether they it was profound or not so profound. The thing that they all said, unprompted, was that they missed birdsong the most, and it didn't matter whether they had no kind of particular relationship with nature, whether they were kind of completely, couldn't tell a sparrow from a pterodactyl. They all said that was the thing that they missed the most, because and thinking about it, I think it's like that thing of when there's an eclipse, the birds go silent. So when you can't hear bird song, when there is no bird song, it's a sign of something profoundly wrong in the world. So I mean, who knows? But it was really interesting, and there were two things that everybody with hearing loss said, unprompted and universally, was it was birdsong they missed the most, and also hearing loss was incredibly tiring. I don't know, Giles, if your father was did he notice that that the hearing loss had an impact on his energy levels?
I can't remember because I was quite young when it started happening. I think he would find it. He would find it exhausting to be in a situation where he'd have to listen, and that wasn't music. That was conversation. So dinner parties, or having dinner with people, or meeting strangers, would be more exhausting for him. It would be a tough because of, I suppose, because the amount of processing his brain's doing in order to understand. It's a bit like, in a funny way, being able to barely speak a language and have a conversation, because you're constantly lip reading and filling in the blanks. Going back to the visual thing, I mean, one of the things that Geordie, the friend of mine who had his cochlear implants, is an extraordinary lip reader. I mean, absolutely, from a baby, when his mum took him to the doctors and said, I think my son's deaf. At that stage, they couldn't do the test, and he said he's not deaf. It wasn't until they covered their mouths they realised he was lip reading. And it's just an instinctive thing, and I think my father obviously learned how to lip read, or learn, you do it, and it just becomes very taxing because you're not used to it, and that was what made him tired, I suppose.
Which is one of the things that sort of brings us onto the pandemic, and everybody having to wear masks and stand further away, which is fantastic for kind of public health.
Absolutely, but what's interesting about the masking is how many people have said to me, "I think masks affect my hearing."
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting. I mean, it's way too early. I did contact somebody who I was interested in whether there had been any studies made into whether the year or so has changed anything in the kind of hearing world, and just how people had responded to being forced to stand further away from each other and cover their mouths, but also the fact that certainly during the first lockdown that changed the kind of national acoustic totally. The sound of Britain altered completely, and whether that's kind of changed anything. But yeah, I mean, I guess the last year is a kind of magnificent program in making things difficult for kind of anybody with hearing loss.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to point out. Oh, sorry, Chad. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Point out.
Well, no, I was just going to say something stupid, which is that if you can't tell the difference between a sparrow and a pterodactyl, your hearing is the last of your problems. It's.
I just wanted to throw out the binaural thing too, because that's another thing that I've wondered about, if that is something that can help people with some hearing loss hear a little bit better. And Giles, you were mentioning you were working with what was the system that you're talking about?
I've been working on Dolby Atmos. There's a big binaural surge about to hit us. A lot of people, Apple and Dolby themselves, and THX, and a bunch of companies are working on binaural interpretations of multi-channel audio, which to be honest, were terrible for a long time. But in my experience, they've become exponentially better in the last actually year or so. I mean, the improvements are quite extraordinary. I mean, lots to do with measuring people's heads and this what's about to hit us, but it's interesting. I wonder whether that'll help hearing. It's interesting. I mean, if you can separate signals, that does help understanding of for instance, if we could, it's a long way up, but no reason why not. One of the issues obviously with hearing aids is compression, and not being able to intelligently listen. Hearing aids are very dumb, but they're getting a lot smarter, as Susan mentioned. But maybe if there's a binaural hearing aid where there's space around you, you would have better selection. You'd have better. That would be it.
Well, it is something that you can do if it's if you have a good reproduction. Like some headphones just don't seem to work with binaural. But if you have a good recording and decent headphones of some kind, you really can have you get the cocktail room effect. You can pick out, with binaural, if you hear your name, you can focus on that conversation.
But interesting, Chad, the headphones not working is not probably the headphones not working for you opposed to headphones, because it's also to do with how the headphones relate to your head shape.
Yeah, absolutely. How they work with, and my anomalies with my hearing.
Well, it's funny. The guy, I hope he's not cool, but there's a when they introduced from Dolby, when I had my stereo mixer Sgt. Pepper, my Atmos mixer Sgt. Pepper, and a binaural renderer, and and I was doing it live, I was trying to understand the binaural render. It was like whack-a-mole because there was so much phase issues. And I said, it just doesn't work for me. And he goes, it works fine for me. And I looked at him, and he had a very, very square head. I didn't want to say anything. I was like, well, I don't, anyway.
But if you're working with SpongeBob, that's the deal.
Lego, man.
Well, but I think, and that's one of the things that Apple's trying to tackle with the adaptive acoustics, is that one of the ways that binaural can work for more people is to get acoustic cues as you move your head. And when you lose all of your head tracking, it's really difficult to then believe in the space you're supposedly listening in. So,
well, it's pretty good what they're doing now. Actually, it's pretty good. I know we go off top of this. Actually, I've been quite impressed by it. I'm gonna have to jump off in a second, I'm afraid, guys. But,
all right, thank you so much, Giles. It's great, and I will get you on here for one of these 6-hour one-on-one interviews as well.
Oh yeah, there's no one. I don't know. I mean, anyone would have put me for 6 hours, but thank you. But listen, Susan, Bella, Chad, thank you. So a really brilliant, fascinating insights. You make me feel very dumb about stuff, but thank you for having me.
Oh, thanks for coming on and talking with us.
Oh, listen, anytime. Thank you, guys.
Nice to meet you.
Thanks, Giles.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.
Before I forget, I just want to put two things out there. I don't have to talk about them now, but I just wanted to make sure we touched on them in some way. But the binaural thing and what you were saying with head movement is such a huge thing with hearing. Is that cock of the head and turning, and because when I started getting into binaural recording, I thought I was trying to figure out ways of making it really accurate, like get real good spatial cues. And what I found, because I would have somebody do the old Ugo Zuccarelli thing with a matchbox and shake it down to my ankles and stuff, and I found that just hearing as a human is actually not very good if you can't move, like your location process. So I was sitting there going, oh my gosh, my eyes are closed. And the matches would be here, but I'd be saying, oh, so you're back here. And I opened my eyes, no, they were here. And because I wasn't moving. I was really surprised about that. So that's something that would be interesting to have a little bit of insight from with your knowledge. And the other thing is something that I think is related and I mentioned Ugo Zuccarelli because it was his big thing, that his whole system of holophonics, which I heard several times, which blew me away, actually, when I did hear it. Not for music, though. The stuff that I heard that was like orchestral, I thought sounded quite weird. But anything that was simple, well, that sound is not simple, but you know what I mean, just a single source of sound somewhere moving about the head. It was hyper real. I could actually tell or locate it better with holophonics than I could just listening with, my own two ears. And his system was based on autoacoustics, which that's sort of what I wanted to ask you about, because I really know nothing about autoacoustics, which is, do you know anything about it, Andrew?
No, I think we should have this, leave this to Susan.
Okay, yeah, because it's about your cochlea actually emitting sounds.
Right. Yeah, autoacoustic emissions are below the threshold of hearing, but it's basically a sine wave, usually in the area of the region between 1.5K and 2.5K. It's a sound that comes out of your ears, and it can be measured with really sensitive microphones placed in the ear canal. The distortion product autoacoustic emission is something that they do in the audiologist's office. The autoacoustic emission is caused by outer hair cells, which are little cochlear amplifiers, ringing. Healthy ears will produce sound from those little outer hair cells ringing. And in fact, if you've got some damage to your outer hair cells, the doctor won't be able to pick up on an autoacoustic emission. So their presence is the sign of healthy outer hair cells. Their absence may or may not be a sign of a problem, because they don't always produce noise. They just sometimes, as part of their little metabolic process, they just start to ring. They go into feedback.
And do they
The thing
produce
is,
it by running the ear system backwards, so they create a pressure wave in the liquid that goes out through the middle ear and back to the eardrum? The eardrum is the speaker, or is it a different mechanism?
it's a mechanical mechanism. It can actually be picked up by the eardrum. It's bones in the middle ear and the eardrum are vibrating in reverse from mechanical activity from these little guys. The little outer hair cells, they exhibit electromotility. They can physically change their shape. So they start bouncing up and down. They're actually moving the basilar membrane, and that's the whole process is working in reverse. But the thing about spatial localization, and boy, you really got me thinking about something here, Chad, because I've got a pet theory about binaural localization. And now, based on some of the stuff you said, I think I might be wrong. But if we're listening to a pure sine wave, let's take 4K, for example, and we're blindfolded. If it's coming from straight in front of us, easy enough. The sine wave is reaching both ears at the same time. But as soon as you start moving the, let's say, pretend loudspeaker around your head, you're blindfolded and it's just 4K, there's a cone of confusion. There's a wide range of degrees of azimuth in which you've got no idea where that thing is coming from, because it is going to add in phase at the opposite ear, and you're like, it could be anywhere.
Yeah.
So we very rarely listen to a pure tone. Most of the time we listen to things that are broadband or complex tones. So if you're hearing a click and you're not sure where it's coming from, if your eyes are closed, you're snapping your fingers around your head, you're hearing a lot of different frequencies at once. Mm-hmm. So if you can't tell where it's coming from, you move your head and the auditory system figures out whichever frequencies aren't canceling, that must be the true frequency. So it's listening for those phase cancellations. It's spreading it out across all the different frequencies in the click sound. And then it's saying it must be coming from here. And moving our head helps us with spatial localization. Yeah. The thing about binaural sound is it's got me wondering why quad didn't take off in the 70s. Quad, remember the two speakers in the front and then the two big speakers in the back, and why binaural listening hasn't become as popular as you might predict. And I think it's because we evolved to not like the sound of sound sources approaching us from behind. I think that might be anxiety producing. If you've got something coming up on you from behind where you can't see it, I think my pet theory is that we don't like binaural audio for our music anyway, because it promotes anxiety.
It brings us back to the pterodactyls.
Yeah, I think it maybe does. I don't know if that's true.
But we learn with distortion and stuff to like it if we are in a safe space and we learn to be in the safe space. I think we do often like. I mean, we often hear like people in bands. That, like with music, one of the most important things with any kind of music really for a lot of us is there needs to be some danger, perceptible danger in the music, whether that's lyrically, sonically, performance wise. It can be a ballad about a beautiful thing, but it becomes quite boring, well, at least to me, and I sort of shrug, don't need to hear that. If there's not some form of danger in there, and I'm not sure I can always define what the danger needs to be. I can sit there and work on something and get to a point where I think, yeah, that's sounding like it's got that little spark of danger in there to me. For me, a lot, I rely on distortion, heavy panning, and I rely on things not being quite so well balanced. I like things like, you get a perfect mix and then put the hi-hat 4 dB too loud. I like that, okay? So, but just the one thing. So you really have that contrast of everything being right, except there's one thing. Many people don't like that for possibly the reason that you're saying, is that the danger factor is too much. And you were also saying that some of us develop liking some of this and others don't. We have different perspectives on what makes us feel good in listening, don't we? So that's a consideration as well.
Liking is related to stress. That's well known, and that it follows an inverted U shape. So too little stress, it's just not stimulating enough, and it's boring. We don't listen to children's songs. We don't eat baby food. It's just not stimulating enough. But as you start to add some elements of, as you say, danger, or add some elements of tension or novelty, some surprising sounds, some surprising ingredients, our liking starts to go up, 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 until it passes the peak. And you get to that balance, and it's different for each one of us. Some people like their stuff a little bit more conservative, others like their stimuli a little bit more adventurous. But for all of us, there's going to be a point where it's just too stimulating, too stress inducing, too arousing. Okay. To be pleasant. All of us have that sweet spot, that perfect blend where we like our stimuli to be.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point.
I like how my friend Tommy Jordan says, music is an expression of life. And life is danger and it's safety, and it's simple and it's complex, and it's ugly and it's beautiful, and it stinks and it smells sweet. And in our music, it can feel cheesy to us if it doesn't reflect the yin and the yang, if it doesn't reflect darkness and light, and some of that tension as well as the release.
It's contrast. It's it's what we strive for in writing and sonics, and it's what gives like a mixed life, really. So yeah.
And if you take it away, I mean, if you with hearing loss, you're taking all that stimulus, all that communication, all those neurons firing, all those nerves kind of doing their thing, all that dopamine, all that kind of that all fades out.
That's crazy. Yeah, I don't know how I deal with that.
It's like porridgey existence, where you go back, as you say, Susan, to kind of like sort of baby food stage, and it's kind of like that. I mean, I guess what I tried to do in the book was sort of illustrate what it's actually like, which is actually that, and I think this is true of sort of most forms of hearing loss, is that what you hear are the exclamation marks. So if you're in a city, then you probably hear the screech of brakes, and you'd probably hear something banging, and you'd hear sirens, obviously, and you'd hear somebody shouting and a baby crying, and so you hear the exclamation marks. You don't hear the conversation. You don't hear all the stuff below that, and so actually, in some ways, because you're just getting the exclamation marks, it's always a state of high alert. There's like porridgey high alert, which is not very good way of describing it, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. And I think also it's easy when you think about your senses. Visual intake is obviously by far our most used sense for experiencing the world. But for experiencing art, sound has got to be equal, if not bigger then, because you've got books that are purely visual, paintings purely visual, sculptures purely visual. Pretty much every other art form it is sound, or it has sound attached to it. So I think that our hearing, in terms of experience, not mundane things, but extraordinary things, it's a much more important sense. And I just made that up, and it's probably wrong, but I'm going to stick to it.
Well, the other thing about sound, I mean, because all our, like, you're seeing and reading, whatever you do with sight, most of what you do requires a process of identification of what you're looking at, or what you like, language, what you're reading. Sound doesn't require that. Sound, you can be in a coma and your brain is still hearing and processing sound. So it bypasses that whole process of identification, which is crazy, really, that it's so powerful that it goes in whether you want it to or not.
Which is unfortunately why the army now uses it uses sound as white torture.
Yeah.
Gosh.
Because it's involuntary. You have no choice about whether you hear or not.
Yeah.
Just found a book about that recently, about sound, music, in fact, of being used as a weapon in the Iraq War. And they talked about how the soldiers would try to get really creative. And sometimes with prisoners, they would blast them Metallica, and they'd follow that up with like the Barney theme song, the children's music. And they also wrote in this book about Manuel Noriega and how the soldiers were blasting Led Zeppelin and AC/DC and Guns N' Roses while he was holed up in his Vatican refuge. And after a week, Noriega, who was an opera lover, said, "I surrender." And the soldiers were saying, actually, we weren't using it as a weapon. We were blasting that music to increase the soldiers' morale. So when it comes to sound, one person's ceiling is another person's floor.
Yeah.
What was torture to Noriega was, "Oh, this is great," to the American soldiers. It works that way.
Amazing.
Hey, I just want to go back to one. We don't even have to go into it in any big way, but it's going back to the auto acoustics a little bit, but with of holophonics and Ugo Zuccarelli, and no.
I don't know him. I know very little about it.
Oh, okay. I'd be interested to know a little bit more because his theory, the way he made holophonics work for localization, so he says, was taking into account the sound emitted by the cochlea and using that. And he created a head-looking kind of thing that nobody knows what was in it. It was patented, and he didn't sell them. He only leased them out, and you had to pay for an operator to come with them to record with it. But it was truly, truly amazing. I've never heard anything as good for localizing on headphones without having to move or anything. You just put headphones on, you listen to some of the sounds that he recorded, whether it was a haircut or a plane flying over or matchboxes or shampoo, whatever it was scary how good it sounded. And supposedly the only difference between him and his competitors was his theories on autoacoustics, I mean.
I wonder about that. And maybe he was taking into account the efferent pathway. So inside our auditory brainstem, we've got these two nuclei, the superior olivary nuclei, and they're sitting there next to each other, the left side and the right side, and they're comparing signals from the left and right ears. And they have inside of them something that works like coincidence detectors. And those two little things are comparing notes with each other. And when the signal you snap your fingers by your right ear, it's going to get to your right superior olive first. It's got to go around your head, and then it eventually gets to the left one. And so the right holds on to that signal until it arrives in the opposite ear. And then it says, "You good? You good? You got it? You got it? Yeah, I got it. Okay, great. It must be coming from the right side because I got it way before the other guy got it." So that's that path that's helping us to decide where something's coming from in around our heads. But also in those little structures is the signal that's traveling on the auditory nerves in the opposite direction, going into the cochlea. And that signal is terminating at the outer hair cells. And it's helping us to, the outer hair cells are helping us to, as I said earlier, hone in on certain frequencies and ignore others. So maybe, I'm just guessing here, but what if most spatial localization is happening in the superior olive due to the afferent pathway, the one coming up from the inner hair cells? And if you can model it, if you can quantify it, you can model it, and you can design a computer to do what the little circuits are doing. But maybe what he did is take into account the additional pathway that's going in the opposite direction, going to the outer hair cells. Maybe he modeled that and included it in his design to give it even greater spatial resolution and something that works closer to what our actual body's actually doing.
Okay.
This would also help explain why it is so physically uncomfortable when you listen to, let's say, the intro of a song that has a single instrument hard panned in headphones, because that's acoustically impossible. It means your ear has gone dead and things start freaking out. So that's why, I mean, because it physically feels uncomfortable. It's not just, oh, I don't like the way that sounds.
For the non-specialists in the audience, what's hard panning?
When a signal is only on the right or only on the left. It's because usually you can put things anywhere in between, but quite often, I mean, I do this a lot. One is all the way on the left, one's all the way on the right. But when things are happening on both sides, you don't notice that you're not necessarily hearing that one in both ears because, oh, it's being drowned out by something else. But there are times when a song gets quiet and you only have that one instrument left, and then you've got complete silence on the other side, which of course is impossible.
But this is really, it's really prevalent, or you really notice it on headphones where there's no crosstalk.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what we're talking about here. So
yes.
And there have been tests, I've seen it. I got one in Scientific American like 30 years ago. I remember something came with a little record, and it was showing you sort of like your blind spots or something in your hearing, where you put a headphones on and play this little plastic disc, and it would put one tone over here, and then it would do a pulse tone or something over. I can't remember exactly, but what it did was I wish I could remember the specifics of it. I'll have to look it up, but it did create weird aural illusions.
Because your brain would try very, very hard to make that something that would be naturally possible. It's
really bizarre what happens, when you have no crosstalk, and you really just have headphones on, and you can do that.
It's possible to trade off the interaural level differences with the interaural timing differences, which are interaural phase differences. You can trade off and cause some really weird acoustic perceptions, but it is different whether you're listening on loudspeakers where we localize something in 3D space, or if you're listening on headphones. They don't use the term localize, they use lateralize, because if you're listening, psychoacousticians, if you're listening on headphones or earbuds, you're only lateralizing it inside the head. You're saying it's coming from the center of my head, or one side or the other side, whereas with speakers, you will localize it to outside the world. Yeah. It was a really cool thing, but boy, if I wish I was still making records, because I'd like to try this. It was a really cool experiment. So years ago, psychoacousticians put microphones inside plaster casts of pinnae, the ears, just the ears, no head or anything, just the ears. And they put the microphones inside, and they made some recordings, and then they played those recordings for listeners over headphones. And listeners reported that, quote, they were listening through ears that weren't their own. And the listeners reported that the sounds were also, quote, out in 3D space, not in their heads as they normally would be with headphones. And I just thought, wow, what if you recorded a drum kit with microphones through those plaster pinnae, and then you come to the bridge in the song, and all of a sudden it leaves your head and it goes outside of your head and then comes back in. How cool would that be?
Well, that's the thing with binaural is your normal stereo, and anything that goes mono does. It just goes to the center, to the top. And with my thing with binaural, even on speakers, because you lose the binaural effect, and also with binaural, if you add other signals with it. I've for the last 25 years used a binaural head for my drums. Exactly, like for overhead. That's my overhead mic. It's, if on headphones, it's great. It just has, you don't hear it binaurally anymore because you've added guitars and microphone on the kick drum and on the snare drum, and there's bass and there's vocals. So you no longer are aware of a binaural field. But when you play it on speakers, you get something different than if you just had the two overhead microphones. You actually get a kind of fishbowl, like that goes, instead of going across the speakers or necessarily just coming out at you, you actually get this thing that seems to go, at least my ears hear it that way, between the speakers, is slightly back and around. And I also get that same sense. So I get kind of a binaural sense, but yeah, I love playing with that kind of stuff.
That's a really cool thing. I loved in learning, though, that over the course of our lifetimes, as you mentioned at the beginning of the talk, Andrew, talking about the pinna and what it does, it's a very complex direction-dependent filter, and it boosts frequencies in the 1K to 4K region with this weirdo shape that we got going on here. But if you were to take these off and swap them out for the shape of someone else's pinna, you'd be messed up. Your ability to localize sounds, your whole hearing profile would change. We hear what we hear based on the unique shape of this little thing that we've been living with our whole lives.
So I'm wondering, because I've made several records with my own binaural kit, just some cheap microphones that I would hang right there and record, and that's the whole record. I mean, I've got a few that I did for Real World, Peter Gabriel's label, and I wonder if it's driving people crazy.
Well, we should do some listening, because I would love to sort of compare notes with you with your pinna, because I was going to ask about that too, because obviously the Neumann head doesn't have pinna; it's just the right size but it's Omni mics just poking out the sides, right? There are no fully formed ears. But
yes,
you've done tons of, but you've also done a ton of location recording as well, which I'm sure to you sounds incredibly binaural, and I'm wondering how binaural it is to other people.
Well, the Neumann head actually has your ears. They're latex molded. It's an average of 10 German students, and that they selected. I don't know what for, but how they got selected.
Oh, right. So we have the same sort of issues.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't.
So I'm wondering, should we take some questions from the peeps at this point? Is that cool?
Yeah, I was. We've got all this stuff we've talked about. It'd be really nice to know how, especially we can help people with.
Exactly. Now, the only rule I'm going to make is you're not allowed to ask Tchad how he made a certain record sound a certain way, and we're not talking about compressors.
Yeah, great. That's great for me.
So, Mark?
And you.
I think Mark will come in, because we can ask plenty of questions about
I'm
records
just gonna take 1 minute. I'll be right back. Comfort stop.
Mute yourself. And I think Mark will join us in a second, and hopefully there have been some questions. I would imagine.
Hello, hello, hello.
Hello, hello.
This has been amazing. Guys, I've learned so much, as has everybody in the chat room and everything. You guys are the perfect people to hear talk about this, so thank you very much for your expertise.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
Great.
Not Tchad. I'm glad Chad's gone at this point, but you two, Susan and Bella, really, thank you so much.
It's absolutely amazing. It's it's a pretty amazing gathering of people and expertises and what's the plural of expertise? Whatever, yeah. But just getting so many amazing people just to and with different experiences of sound is kind of very cool.
Yeah.
I am so eager to read your book, and I loved. I read somewhere that you said, that our sight gives us information, but our ears give us other people. I thought that was so beautiful.
Oh, thank you. It's yeah, I guess that's because you don't realize, I guess, until you start losing it, how much your ears and your hearing is your absolute route through to the world. It is your connection. It is your communication. It's everything. And Yeah, and if you close down that link, if that gradually starts to fade out, or all those channels, it yeah, it is like having other people taken away from you, I guess. Oh, that's what it felt.
That was the whole theme in that movie I was talking about earlier when we first got on, The Sound of Metal. It was this man who lost his hearing suddenly, and his isolation was the theme in that movie of how he had to learn to cope with that.
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, that it is. It's very definitely it's a deprivation, not just of sound, but of contact.
Yeah, and it's very different to being born deaf. I've got a cousin who's deaf, and all of the things you talk about emotionally have never occurred to him. It's just not, that's not the world he's in. But to enter that world later on, having built your vision of the your universe with sound, it's got to be really profoundly disturbing.
It's really profoundly disturbing, but it's 3 times as awesome when you get it back.
Yeah.
That knowledge is so profound. But as you say, I mean, those who are born profoundly deaf, or who exist within a deaf with a capital D sort of community, are, their understanding of the world is as richer than ours, and they feel no loss. There is no loss.
Well, and I think, and the corollary, like supposedly Stevie Wonder has been offered retinal implants now. Like they could actually reverse his vision loss, and he doesn't want any part of it. I mean, this may not be true, might be apocryphal, but he's worried about how that would affect his creativity, and that's not the world he knows. So, it is interesting. But yes, to lose it and then get it back, that's all those the opioid receptors, you said? Go for it. And it becomes addictive then, doesn't it?
For sure, yeah, exactly. I think my I didn't realize that I was sort of mega dosed on opioids, but yeah, absolutely.
Bring it on. All right, Mark, what do you got for us?
Awesome. All right. I was gonna make a joke about your favorite vocal compressor, but I'm just gonna skip it. No, I suppose it just
joke made, Mark.
There it is. All right, so we have a ton of questions, guys, in the chat room. If you're watching anywhere other than Crowdcast, head over to Puremix. You guys can get to the Crowdcast room that way. That's where we're taking the questions from. And everybody in the Crowdcast chat room, if you haven't gotten your questions in, make sure you get them in now, and you can upvote your favorite ones to make sure that we get to them. So we'll start with our most upvoted question. This one's from Alejandro Alvarez. And he asks, does your state of mind influence how you hear things? And if so, is there a way to train yourself to hear things the same way, no matter what the state of mind you're in is? Thank
you. From a purely unscientific place, I'd say it absolutely does affect how you hear, your state of mind. And yeah, you can try changing it, but I think that's a good thing. Having your state of mind change and having you hear things differently over time. I think that really helps me in my job.
It is hearing is a metabolic process, and that means your thresholds of hearing change throughout the day. When your ears are tired, literally, you're not hearing as well, is when they're fresh. So yeah, and attentional states, your capacity to focus and pay attention affects how you hear things. The body, the whole nervous system is sending out its resources and its energy and its things it's doing to the whole body. I had an advisor years ago who used to remind us all the time, the whole brain, it's the whole brain that's processing things. So while you're listening, you're also digesting, and you got your things you're thinking about in memory, and there's things you're seeing, things you're smelling, things you're tasting. All of that is going on while you're listening, and anything can distract you and pull attentional resources away from hearing to send them somewhere else.
It doesn't also temperature, humidity, everything's going to affect your hearing. So there's nothing, you can't control that. I mean, maybe if you know, like I said, you have a little bit of a drink, maybe it can even things out for you.
And I think it's also important to mention, and I'm actually shocked it didn't come up yet, but you talk about the fact that it's a metabolic process in amongst the metabolic universe that is your body. And the sort of corollary to that is that a lot of hearing problems are caused by things that have nothing to do with the hearing system. Like I have sudden onset ringing, bilateral. So the exact same frequency in both ears. It happened 4 months ago that it got louder, and I talked to Susan almost immediately. And still trying to figure out like what to do. I mean, and it doesn't bother me a huge amount, but it's there. But most likely it's because of something else. It's not because I've somehow managed to damage that part of the basilar membrane in both ears at once. It's to do with lack of sleep or stress or not seeing people or not going to the pub or something like that. And some of it is reversible and some of it is not, the same way of physical hearing loss damage. Those words came out in the wrong order, but you know what I mean. The same way. But so the same way your mood will affect what you hear, anything that's going on in your body will affect not only how you perceive sound, but also the hearing mechanism itself.
That's 100% correct. And hearing anomalies can be caused by inflammation. It can be caused by autoimmune disorders. It can be caused by vasoconstriction. There are all manner of things that can impinge upon the cochlea and cranial nerve 8, the vestibular cochlear nerve, and cause it to not function properly. That, as you said, didn't have anything to do with hair cells or anything that's happening in the cochlea. It's happening in the body, and it's just affecting your hearing.
And that tinnitus, especially like ringing in your ears, is the perfect example of the feedback mechanisms of going from brain to ear. Because let's say you've got ringing in one ear because that frequency is damaged within your hearing system. Well, the point is you can't hear that frequency anymore, but you're hearing that frequency all the time, but you can't hear it anymore, but you're hearing it. And it's your brain testing the system to say, hey, I'm not hearing that anymore. What the hell is going on down there? So you have the perception of hearing it, but it's actually started up in the auditory cortex working backwards, is the way I understand it.
Yeah, tinnitus can have a number of different origins, but sometimes, let's say an outer hair cell is damaged in the region that corresponds to 3.5 K. The nerve is like, what happened? What's going on? I'm not getting any input. So it turns up the gain to compensate for the reduced input stage. It just cranks the metabolic gain in that region to help you hear that particular frequency a little better. And it can crank it up to the point where you're actually perceiving it as sound, even though there is no mechanical activity corresponding there. I did want to say, as long as we're here, I did a bit of reading on the most recent treatments for tinnitus sufferers. And there's great heterogeneity in the treatments and effectiveness of treatments. Turns out everybody's pretty different when it comes to their tinnitus, where it originates and whether or not they respond to it. But a couple of things I did want to share, gender differences. I wrote this down so I wouldn't forget it. Women respond more than men to the high definition, the transcranial direct current stimulation. They put a mild dose of electricity, 2 electrodes just attached around the scalp. Women show more responsiveness than men to that treatment. And men show more responsiveness to a combination of the tinnitus retraining therapy plus the cognitive behavioral therapy. By and large, though, there's a massive study done in Europe not long ago, and they showed that the single most effective treatment is simply the duration of the treatment. It doesn't even matter which treatment so much as how long you stick with it. The longer you stick with it, the better your chances of reducing your tinnitus.
Wow. And just to clarify, so, and I may get this wrong, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but the tinnitus retraining therapy is when you identify what frequency it is that's ringing and you stimulate around that frequency range, which will retrain the bits that are ringing at that frequency to think that the frequencies next to them are more important, and makes them go, you know what, forget that frequency. Let me go help these guys out because these are obviously important frequencies to listen to. And the cognitive retraining is more about, it's basically just learn to live with it. Don't focus on it. Change the way you think about the ringing in your ears. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. The tinnitus retraining therapy, let's say you've got 1K, and that's where your tinnitus frequency is. And so the brain thinks it's always hearing 1K, and it figures that 1K is really important to this person. I really need to pay attention to that because we're listening to it all day long. So you have to train the auditory cortex. No. It's not 1K I want you to pay attention to. It's 1.2K. So for twice a day, usually 30 minutes a day, 2 times a day, you'll listen to headphones with 1.2K, and your brain goes, oh, I see. It's 1.2K that you're interested in. And the neighboring neurons in the auditory cortex that are sitting right next to that 1K region are like, oh, I guess 1K is not important anymore. And they will reroute themselves to pay attention to this signal that now you're apparently really into, the 1.2K. It's been shown to help reduce the perception of it, retraining the brain. And the other thing with the cognitive behavioral therapy is to get you to basically tune it out, to just let your brain know, don't get excited, don't get upset. We don't need to be releasing any cortisol. We don't need to be stressed, because stress just exacerbates it and makes it worse. Just be cool. And if your system can calm down, it'll be less active and won't bother you as much. But as the reading shows that men are more likely to respond to that than women, perhaps due to the presence of estrogen. Estrogen affects our hearing a little bit, and women have a different amount of it than men do.
And it's also a mezcal-based therapy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, I believe that originated somewhere in the American Southwest, yes.
Yeah. Okay, Mark, sorry, we digressed.
Awesome. No, that's great. Before I continue, there was, yes, here it is. Okay, this is from Eric Tessier in the chat, and he says, I just want to thank you for this. I've been dealing with hearing loss for the last 7 years due to an eardrum perforation, losing all bass frequencies and messing up my face perception big time. I've had many anxiety crises, doubts, third surgery last January, and thanks for talking about those issues and breaking the taboos about hearing loss in the industry. So that's from Eric.
Excellent.
Thank you, that I thought you guys should hear.
Great.
And our next question is from Julio, and Julio asks, is there any hope for someone who suffers from tinnitus to be successful as a music producer and recording engineer?
Yes.
If you consider any of us successful, then yes, is the answer. I suffer from it, and I'm still, well, I'll never work again because I just said that, right?
Yeah.
But
I've had, I started with my ears cockeyed. As a kid, I was brought up with guns. I used to shoot a lot, and a rifle shoot. And this is before anybody would say, put any kind of hearing protection on. And it wasn't big calibers, but it doesn't matter. A 22 or a 410 shotgun is loud enough. And I remember well the first shot of the day. It was just, bam, and it just sounded like somebody took a hammer to the tabletop, like boom, and then maybe a half a second later, you would just hear it go bap, boom. It's just all of a sudden, this ear would just go because the bullet was exiting, on this side because aiming. So it was this ear that took a beating. So I know this ear, and I've had it tested years ago. It really worried me for, I was in crisis when I was mixing, I thought my mixes weren't very good because my hearing was screwy. And it's taken me years to learn that it had nothing, it was just my mixes weren't good. It had nothing to do with my ear problem, because I'm doing, the last couple of decades have been really good. And it doesn't seem to bother me. So yeah, I think all the stuff we've been talking about is trying to get away from the idea that if you have anomalies in your hearing, and they can be quite severe. Mine, I don't think are that severe. They're pretty big, but certainly not like George Martin. I don't have any nerve. What was it? What was his damage? I forget. But I have tinnitus, and I have a bad eustachian tube. This ear often feels like there's a pillow over it. It goes away, comes back. I get ringing, goes away. I have a constant ringing. And I've learned to deal with it. And it's still, I still have some worries some days, but I always overcome the worry and just get on with the work.
And while you're working, when you're in it, you don't hear it.
Yeah.
And that is the core of the behavioral therapies, is to not pay attention to it and not let it distract you from what else you're doing. And anytime I hit stop, if I listen for it, like, oh, yep, still ringing, yep, there it is, hit play again, and I'm thinking about something else and I'm ignoring it. And I'm probably still hearing it. But like we were talking about earlier, your brain is very good at damping things and making it so that only the information you're trying to hear is heard. And it would have to be pretty severe to always poke its head over the wall and make you pay attention to it. If it's that severe, then possibly, yes, it could interfere, but that would interfere with any job you tried to do. You wouldn't be able to concentrate on anything.
I think my understanding of it is as well from speaking to musicians and understanding a little bit more than when I started the book, was that basically some form of hearing loss or tinnitus within the music industry is the norm. It's not aberrant. It's not that, a few outliers, like George Martin have problems. If you're either A, in that older age bracket, or B, have ever stood really close to an amp for a prolonged period of time, your hearing is fairly stuffed, or bits of your hearing and stuff. So the people who are creating music, the people who are obsessed with music, the people who are listening to music, the people who are mixing it, producing it, so the majority, as far as I understand it, not the minority, the majority have some form of either mild or severe or profound hearing loss, or tinnitus. So your music is being made by people who don't necessarily have great hearing. So in terms of that original question about can you be a sound engineer with tinnitus, speaking as the only person who's not a sound engineer in any form, I would say, yeah. I mean,
it's a requirement.
Yeah. Welcome to the club. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So let's see. We'll go on to our next question from Michael Graham. And wow, lots of really good questions coming in pretty quickly. Okay, so how does hearing change usually as we get older?
Susan?
A fellow named Gerald Fleischer published a big paper in 2008, and he showed the results of his investigation of just that question. Something like 4,000 participants. He tested. He had an all-male population because he wanted to control for gender, and he tested people between the ages of 18 and 70 in Europe and in China. And he looked at how hearing rolls off. And sure enough, if you're 70 years old, you kind of lost 10K, 8K a little bit. If you're 60 years old, it's going to roll off a little sooner. I'm 50 years old and 40. For every decade, starting to roll off a little bit more. But you get an audio test in an audiologist's office, you'll see that the window for so-called normal hearing is about 20 dB wide. So you can lose 10, even 20 dB at a certain frequency and still be considered relatively normal. We are going to lose something with age, just like the shape of the cornea on our eyes is going to change with age. But musical training in childhood and being bilingual, really working out that auditory path, confers some benefits that can help compensate for age-related hearing loss. And then there is great variability among people. Some people have inherited genes that predict early onset hearing loss. Other people don't have that same set of genes. There's a genetic component to hearing loss as well.
Okay.
Awesome. Okay. So moving on then. Al, your pal, says, hi all, thanks for coming together to discuss this topic. Last year on Andrew Talks to Awesome People, Susan mentioned an Oxycontin spray being developed for tinnitus. Is there any more info on that now? Thanks, Alex.
That was oxytocin, the nasal spray. And Andrew had sent me a link by a researcher whose name is Berthold Langes. I don't think I'm pronouncing it right. This was also part of his team. His team is looking at many, many ways in which we can alleviate the suffering of tinnitus. The oxytocin nasal spray was shown to reduce tinnitus perception a good deal. You just spray this in your nose, and the paper came out in 2017. So I don't know if that product is on the market yet, but maybe it's in clinical trials. But Dr. Langes, his work is also looking at something that Andrew had shared with me, stimulation, electrical stimulation on your tongue, which is so cool. I know, it's super cool. Electrical stimulation on your tongue, very mild, is close enough to cranial nerve 8 that it can help suppress some of the activity and I guess offer a little bit of a relief.
I wonder if that, because, in the studio, the way you test a 9-volt battery is just.
Yep.
So, there you have it. It's from Susan, 9-volt battery produces tinnitus.
Yes, strike that last.
Starting my mix out.
The bottom line is that a lot of research money is being put into looking for effective therapies at reducing tinnitus. And that's something that we know, is that there's a great variety of treatments and a great variety of responses, because everyone's hearing, everyone's body is just a little bit different. We know that antioxidants, drink that pomegranate juice, that can help with your hearing. It can help just restore your body. A healthy diet, a healthy lifestyle can help improve your hearing, because your hearing relies on those metabolites. And if you take good care of your body and you don't abuse it with drugs and try to get enough sleep, you'll hear better than otherwise.
Too late.
You'll hear better, but the music you produce will be shit.
Yeah. But you will produce the hell out of a Barney theme.
Yeah.
Be the greatest mix ever. Susan, I have a question about vascular compression, I think. I have a sensation where one ear will just completely close, and this is within maybe a matter of like 20 to 30 seconds. I'll like have it completely close. There will be ringing, and then it'll slowly open back up, and then usually around 30 seconds it's all over.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Is that the compression thing?
Yeah, I'm not sure what that is. I'm not sure, but you might, if it happens frequently enough, you might want to see your audiologist. There are certain disorders that exhibit that show a little bit of a feeling like, oh, it got blocked for a little bit, and then it comes back. And I think a couple of disorders.
I thought that was really common. I get that.
I get that.
Yeah.
I mean, like,
Check
but
with your
how
audiologist.
frequently do you get it, Mark?
Not very frequently, but if I don't sleep off, or if I don't get enough sleep, if it was like a super long day and then I don't sleep enough, it'll be more present than the following day.
Could be just that. It could be just the exhaustion and your body saying to you, don't do that to me anymore. Bodies are really good at letting us know when we've pissed them off.
Right. Yeah. Also, that would have been amazing if all of you were like, ooh, next question.
Gotta go.
Yeah.
No, I absolutely, I mean, it's, maybe every few weeks it happens, but it definitely happens.
Yeah.
That exact thing. Shuts down, loud, single tone, opens back up, all good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay. A couple people in the chat room say they hear that one as well. Tony Visconti actually in the chat asked if we could talk a little bit more about dealing with tinnitus. I'm not sure how long ago that was. So if you guys feel like we should move on, then let me know. If you guys want to chime in on it a little bit. I don't know if that's just like day-to-day things to manage.
No, I would say this. I've had colleagues at Berkeley approach me and ask for help with their tinnitus. And so I've done a little bit of local research to see who's treating it here in New England. And I've learned that some facilities are absolutely wonderful. Some of them, not so much, but look for those Yelp reviews and look around locally, and you might be able to find a hearing center that is really great at finding just the right therapy for you. As the recent research reports say, your therapy needs to be chosen to be effective for you. What works for the next person won't necessarily work for you. So you have to work together with the audiologist to try out certain things to see what works and what doesn't work for you. There's a lot of research being done on growing new hair cells in vitro and in vivo. There's work being done with stem cells. There's work being done with corticosteroids delivered just directly to the eardrum, and all sorts of things we're making good progress in treating disorders of hearing as well as tinnitus. So check with the hotshot crew in your local area. And there's probably somebody who knows quite a lot about it and can help.
And I'd say one of the things to look at when you're trying to find where to go is, I think I mentioned this almost right at the beginning, but up until very recently, it was always looked upon as hearing loss was irreversible, period. If you got it, get over it, nothing's ever going to happen. And if you go to the websites of all of the different hearing centers in your area, you'll notice as they start describing treatments and what they can do that a lot of them will be still living in that world. And it will mostly be based on behavioral training to just try and make you live with it better. And that is a huge part of any treatment, but you will probably find one that's talking about the tinnitus retraining therapy, that particular phrase. If that is not mentioned on the website, then they're at least 5 years behind and they're not keeping up. That's one of the newer ones that is accepted enough that if they're not offering that, it may not be the thing that will help you, but if they're not offering it, I wouldn't necessarily consider them.
Can I just say hi to Tony Visconti?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, sorry, I actually messed up, guys. I messed up. It's Tony Vicari, which also...
Hey, either way, Tommy.
Yeah, sorry.
Look, either way, I'll take any TV who wants to try it.
Yes, awesome. Okay, cool. So next question is from Tanya Lee, and she says, I've got tinnitus and I've lost some high end, more so on the right. And I have a strange question. When I mix, I have coworkers who seem to want more high end, when to me it seems like too much. Are my ears overcompensating, or do they have more hearing loss than I do? Thanks for this, by the way.
Good question. There's no way we can know if they have more hearing loss than you do. But if I'd say if you do notice the difference between left and right on your ears, then set up on your desk, set up a way that you can easily flip your speakers and see how that changes for you, and maybe even the band members who you're working for. To, you know, and it might give you a clue to something, but I do that quite often. I flop back and forth.
And it could, first of all, there's obviously just perception. Like, I mean, Chad, you like things darker than I do. I would generally have more top end in a mix, and that's just a personal choice. But also, I think it's a bit of the words flown out of my head. It's not necessarily true that you will compensate for hearing loss by boosting more of those frequencies. You won't be focused on that range as much, so you're not going to pay as much attention to the top end. It's not like you're going to crank it until you finally hear enough of it. You will most likely be focused in the frequencies just below it, getting your mid-range right, and the lack of top end it never even occurs to you as that's a place to go looking. But also, most likely, there are just certain frequencies. It's not like you can't hear the entire band of frequencies up there unless you have a specific type of hearing loss. So you need to know more about your own hearing issue to sort of know whether or not you should even be trusting it. It could just be a matter of taste, and it could be the people you're working with like brighter mixes, and then you just have to decide how does that work. Another great way to maybe try and figure it out is to not use your own mixes as a test. To say, look, find me 5 records that you guys think are too dark, 5 records that you think have enough top end. Let me listen to the same records. And it could just be that you don't like things as bright.
That's really good advice. And I think every audio professional should know where to get an online hearing screening. I found out last year through some work we did at Berkeley that the Apple iPhones have really good microphones in them. And if you've got an Apple product and you can download any of those hearing screening devices, softwares, I should say, it works really, really well. You can test your own hearing. I don't know about Android, but I imagine it's probably the same for them as well.
So what frequencies can you do? Can you actually get up to the higher registers? Because generally,
it goes from 250 to 8K.
8K.
For the traditional hearing screening, it goes up to 8K, but you can kind of imagine it probably rolls off above that anyway. But you should be testing your own hearing, not every week, not even every month. The experts at Mass Eye and Ear who work with Berkeley for the Berkeley Hearing Health audio hearing screening app, they say test it once per semester. Remember that it's going to change throughout the day. If you are testing your own hearing using an iPhone and earbuds, make sure the earbuds are seated properly inside your ears. If you notice a loss of low-end hearing, it's most likely due to the fact that the earbuds weren't seated properly in your ears, because normally what we're going to be losing is we'll be losing the higher frequencies rather than the low frequencies. Although some studies have shown that people who go to clubs and raves and things like that, some young people are starting to show some low frequency hearing loss through a different mechanism.
Do you know, with me and mixing, because I've always been quite a dark mixer. I mean, I've gotten brighter over the years. I don't know if that's because my ears have changed or if I've just gotten used to getting my mix to a certain place and then going, I know I got to be brighter, and I add a dB of something, you know. But that might be something to do as well. You know that they want more high frequencies in the mix. Just get it to where you like it, and then crank up the top end a little bit so that they'll like it. I mean, that's, you know, we're making records for other people. We want to get our thing, our stamp on it, and our sound on it. But at the same time, it's got to pass a few hurdles after that, you know.
And also keep in mind, if you do test your hearing and you're finding things, and also talking about the hearing test only going up to 8K, you remember that frequencies are logarithmic when compared to pitch. So from 8 to 16K is only 1 octave. It's not like you've lost the top half of your hearing. It's an octave that is only in the harmonics. I don't know that anything has a fundamental frequency at 8K. So you're up in the harmonics anyway. So just don't freak out about it, but also try and remember what frequency ranges are actually fundamentals of instruments and things like that. Because since most hearing loss is happening in the upper frequencies, it can be really easy to really freak out when you're down at 10K. But that's still pretty high. So anyway, moving on.
And that was a really, really good point, Andrew. I feel like we should have a highlight of some sort. If I can make the screen flash, I would. That was good. On the subject of swapping left and right, I had an interesting experience with Jonathan Little. Little Labs has a headphone and called the Monitor, and it has fast switching of left right swap and everything. And the first time I heard it, I first thing was like, wow, this is great. And then I switched the left and right, and I don't remember the exact song. It was a Led Zeppelin song, but I swapped the left and right, and the guitar had a noticeable drop. And I was like, click, 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 click.
This thing's broken.
I took off the headphones, and Jonathan's like, what'd you think? And I was like, I hate it. I just realized that I'm like, I have some loss in my right ear.
Something, but something, the thing is with that, yes, it can show up. Like your perception though is weird. And maybe Susan can comment on this too, but the perception of each ear, it may not be as hearing, like you may be hearing something much greater than is actually happening. And not only because just perceptions are different, it has to do with what came before. So if you're listening to the thing with the guitar over here and your ears adjust, with headphones on, and your ears are going to adjust to different frequencies and different levels. And the minute you switch it, all of a sudden, you do it that quick, your ears are going to go, oh shit, it takes time to acclimate. So it's not something that you ought to be doing quickly. I should stress that. It's not something, you shouldn't go, click, 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 go back and forth. What I do is I'll listen for an hour or two in one way and then switch and then listen for the next hour or two that way. Yeah. It'd be really scary to start, boom, oh my gosh, that sounds normal. Oh, that sounds horrible. That doesn't work.
That is absolutely right. As soon as you mentioned it, Mark, I thought that would give me the heebie-jeebies if I had to switch really fast back and forth between the left and right. I think it'd give me anxiety. Remember, too, that we have hemispheric specialization. So for nearly all of us, the right auditory cortex over here, the right hemisphere, is most receptive to music, pitch, and rhythm. Right-hand side. And on the left-hand side, it's specialized for speech for 100% of right-handed people and nearly all left-handed people. So when you change the panning, you're changing how you're perceiving what you're hearing. When something's going in your right ear, it's going to go primarily to your left auditory cortex and vice versa. So something that's panned on the right, you're going to tend to hear it as speech. Something that's panned on the left, you're going to tend to hear it for its melodic contour, as melody and as the emotional intonation that is in that signal. So there's another thing that could drop. If you're listening to Jimmy Page and he's on one side and you switch it to the other side, a different auditory cortex is going to be listening to that signal and evaluating it according to a different criteria.
That's amazing.
And there's also, and I don't know where it's I know it's like, it is a personal preference, but I don't know if it comes from experience. But I do know that engineers, they all have their favorite way of placing like maybe a high frequency or mid frequency. And it sounds wrong if you don't do it that way. So like I prefer, the hi-hat on the left, and it's not just because I like being in the drummer's seat. That's another thing. But I remember working with my partner Mitchell, and we used to go we'd have a mix and go and switch it, because I was switching way back when, and going and even listening for a while, but going, it sounded better the other way. Why? It's just the way we're built, right? I mean, yeah.
Yeah, we do have those preferences, and for me, that hi-hat has got to be on the left. The rhythm guitar.
Yeah, even with a left-handed drummer. Yeah.
Yeah. It's got to be.
Right.
So, am I making this up? Because I'm just trying to remember now. But on all the crazy dual mono Beatles mixes, Am I making it up that on most of them that have hard pan vocals, the vocals ended up on the right? I seem to remember that, but I could easily be making that up.
Yeah, I don't know.
And it would that would be, if you had to decide, that would kind of be the choice you'd make then, based on what you were saying.
Do you know about the cambiata illusion? I think you can look it up online. You have to listen to it with headphones. But what it is what you're actually hearing. You put the headphones on in your left ear, and in your right ear, you got the same thing, a stream of alternating high and low notes. Left ear and right ear. That's reality. What you're hearing is your brain organizes all the high notes to be on the right-hand side and all the low notes to be on the left. So you're listening and you hear high on the right, low on the left. You take the headphones, you reverse the headphones, and it doesn't switch. The high stays on the right,
Oh, wow.
the low stays on the left. It's called the cambiata, C-A-M-B-I-A-T-A, the cambiata illusion. And what that has to do with is a misperception, a deliberate, on the part of the brain, misperception of time. When the brain hears something with a really wide melodic contour going really fast, high note, low note, high note, low note, the brain says, I ain't buying it. No person, no musician played that fast stream of high and low notes. Didn't happen. There must be a mistake here. I'm going to correct it for this listener. And the brain divides it up so that you're hearing the high on one side and the low on the other. Why the high would be on the right? It's hypothesized that is the high notes are more musical. The right hemisphere is where we're going to be. It does it automatically, but it's a really cool thing, and it teaches us that perception is not always reality.
Yeah, the beginning of the this auditory scene analysis book is all about that, to show you all of the shenanigans your brain is pulling, and that's one of the studies. And there are tons of them based on rhythm, based on pitch, based on timings, and your brain sorts things and puts them elsewhere because it just makes it feel better.
Cool.
Awesome. Audioist just pasted a link to the cambiata illusion in the chat, so thanks, Audioist.
Excellent.
Check that out later. That sounds pretty fun.
And that especially on the podcast version of this will be great.
Yes.
I didn't realize that people are going to be
the
listening
podcast.
to this with no video, so that presentation at the beginning is even worse. And then
All right. Well, if you're on the podcast, you can go to Puremix, to live events. Andrew talks to awesome people. Click on this episode and all of the links.
You can replay the chat.
And all
Yes.
that is in there. So
Yes.
thanks
for that, Mark.
Yeah, you can replay the chat. Yep. Awesome. Thanks for the tip on switching for a longer period of time, because I actually did like that headphone amp so much that I got it, but I haven't tried doing that for a prolonged period of time.
Yeah,
Only to
you have to
upset
give your
myself about my hearing.
You have to give your ears a chance to acclimate. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Our next question is from Adrian, and Adrian says, does hearing remain the same while sleeping, or can it rest in a sense?
Susan lit up.
Oh,
lit
it's
up,
just so cute to think about it. I anthropomorphize everything, but so there you are, you're asleep, and your eardrums still going in and out. If you got a roommate that's playing the TV or playing music, your eardrums are going in and out. Bones in the middle ear, in and out, hair cells up and down. Auditory nerves are even firing. But up here where it's organized, you are offline. So you know the nervous system oscillates at different rates throughout the day. And if it's oscillating at anywhere between 1 and 8 hertz or thereabouts, it's in the delta or the theta band. And it's not oscillating fast enough for you to be conscious. You're unconscious, you're asleep. So yeah, the ear is still working. The sensory organ is working, but the organization, it's offline. It's not reporting that you're hearing anything until your nervous system starts oscillating at 8 hertz or a little bit hotter than that. And then you're in that alpha state. And now you're conscious, you're awake, and now you're hearing things.
Can I just bring up a sleep thing that has nothing to do with humans, but is just so amazing I want to mention it? So dolphins, right? They're in the water. They got to sleep. So the best place for them to sleep is, I believe, and I'm probably getting this number wrong, but about 3 feet under the water, because they're high enough to be away from any predators in the water, but they're in the water enough to not be seen by any predators from above. So they sleep one lobe of their brain at a time, and the lobe that's there has just enough going on to keep it at exactly that depth and just keep swimming. There you go. Random fact of the day.
Crazy. Wow. That
All
is
right.
crazy.
And I didn't make that one up.
Cool.
Crazy. The real question, though, Andrew, do you know how dolphins wash their fins? Like, what do they use?
I don't know.
They're in the water. Tide.
Oh.
Next question. All right.
Oh dear.
All right. Next question is from, I'll see myself out. Next question is from Michael Graham, and he says, each of my ears are shaped differently on the outside, the pinna. Is that normal, or are most people's the same?
I don't think anybody's is the same, are they?
Yeah, as far as they're kind of like your two eyes and your two hands, very, very similar, but not exactly alike.
I mean, if they're really different, then I think that could be pretty cool. Again, if you're going to be a mixer or doing something in music like that, then you'll have a unique perspective and approach that nobody else will have, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. There actually, we've seen this before in Puremix comments. We've actually seen people comment on the engineers, the size of their ears before. We've seen comments about like, well, look at the size of their ears. They have really big ears. That must mean they're better mixers.
No, well, I don't think so. Because, like, I know for me with earbuds and things, and I'm 6'4". I'm not like a small person, but I need the second to the smallest little cups to get in there. So it's not just about, big, wide open, flappy ears. Like Dumbo, shitty mixer, huge ears.
And anyway, doesn't that just, if you're mixing on headphones, it's a moot point, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Now, Frank Sinatra is considered one of the greatest singers who ever lived, and he had a deformed left ear caused from birth, a badly deformed left ear.
Okay.
Didn't hurt his career.
And all those rugby players who also mix with their cauliflower ears, and the boxers, all of them.
Mm-hmm.
I think the thing that hopefully we got across tonight is that there are so many pieces to the system, and they all can compensate for each. I mean, some of them can't. Your pin is not going to compensate for anything. It's a physical structure. But once you get into the inner ear and up, everything compensates for everything else, and the plasticity in the brain is insane, and things can change. And as physical things change, neurological things would adapt to deal with it. And yeah, there are very few absolutes in this.
And I guess
In other words,
one of the things that's least looked at, the trouble with audiology generally and hearing things, and as we've been sort of saying all the way through this evening, is that it's a bit of a Cinderella subject. People don't really. There probably is in the US. Really decent funding for it, but it's not a sector that people want to go into. So it tends to be it tends to be quite often people sort of working in isolation, doing really interesting bits of kind of research, or kind of or looking at the kind of psychoacoustics, or looking at the kind of psychology of hearing loss or hearing or sound or kind of whatever it is, and they tend to be the cool people because all the people who kind of want who want to have the glory go off to do pediatrics or kind of whatever it is, or neurology or whatever, and these people who want to kind of study acoustics are kind of doing so, and they're doing these amazing pioneering bits of research and really, really cool stuff. but at the moment, what we understand about sound and what we understand about acoustics is there are these kind of rare flashes, but it's just not, it's not understood in the way that other branches of the human body, other parts of the human body are understood. And we haven't even really begun to understand or touch on kind of its psychological impact of different sounds, the way that you know, one of the things that I really like being a non-musician is listening to musicians talking about music, because they talk about the colors of music, and they talk about it with this kind of this whole range of kind of emotion and understanding, this kind of spectrum that non-musicians don't have. The emotional content, the kind of the shades that come from it, the kind of the weather that comes from music, and that's just brilliant. And that's, I guess, what would be fun to kind of develop in the next 10 years is a much greater impact, understanding of kind of what sound does, and its psychological impact on its, and its emotional, what taking it away does, and what having it does, and what are those little kind of buttons that we press. I know that there are certain tracks when I listen to kind of like a rat in a cage. I mean, I got to keep pressing that button. I will listen to the same track for some really kind of, you know, literally, I mean, mainly because I've only got 3 CDs in the car, and I listen to the same thing again and again and again, because it's just pressing that button. It's just pressing that button, and it is, as you say, Susan, sort of down to dopamine, but it's also down to kind of something that we haven't even begun to understand yet, and that's part of what's cool about sound, I think.
Mm.
One of the most intriguing questions in the world to me is what the brain is doing when it goes into its playlist and it says, I want that. And it chooses a song to listen to in any given moment. I want that. I must have that. That's that reward-seeking mechanism that says, you know what would hit the spot right now? This groove, or this chord change, or this melody, or this lyric, or this vocal performance, must have it. And what's so cool is what you just described when you say to yourself, play it again, play it again, play it again. It feels so good. How we can get so excited about a stimulus that we know really well. We know what's coming. We could play it in our heads. And yet, when you're actually hearing it, your brain is gone, oh, it feels so good. Each one of us is different. Each one of us has our own listener profile. Each one of us has our own little happy place that develops over the course of our lifetime. But damn, that is fun to think about how that develops, and that it's in there right now, just waiting for the next time you play a song.
And at the same time, hopefully they will cure what happens when you hear It's a Small World. The most insidious, I mean, I almost hate to say the title of it. It will now be stuck in my head for 3 weeks.
Well, that's another funny thing, the earworm, that a brain loves music so much that when it recognizes, well, this guy's not that busy, I've got what would go good right now would be a little song. And it just pulls up from long-term storage. It'll just pull up a little melody. And it's a small world after.
Oh, God, now you've done it.
There it is. There it is.
I love that a brain says, oh, this would be good right now. And the internal DJ just will.
But this is just,
over and over.
It's just proof.
I have wonderful memories of that ride at Disney.
Yeah, but that's because you were a teenager and it got stuck and all that. But to me, it's just proof that really your brain is a dick. That's there's no other reason to play that song for me.
I have a question about auditory memory that comes up. Fab talked about this. We have a series on the site called How to Listen, and he's talked about sort of what you're mentioning right now about how we can internalize a song in our head and almost play it back. And, there's certain mixes that are even on the mixing level, you can remember, okay, I know exactly that there's a delay at that part. And when you're listening in your head, you can almost hear those exact things and all of that. Fab's talked about our actual auditory memory being extraordinarily short. And he discusses it in terms of like A being different sounds during the mixing process. But I don't remember if he even gives the stat, but do you have anything to add on the topic of actual auditory memory? Because his general thing that he was saying is that we end up fooling ourselves a lot, especially when A being things and we think that we remember how something sounded, but then we actually hear it back and objectively listen. Then yeah.
My doctoral thesis was on that topic. That's what I studied in grad school, was auditory short-term memory. And I compared musicians and non-musicians in that capacity. He's absolutely right. Auditory short-term memory refers to active neural traces above a threshold. So it's whatever you're hearing right now, and it lasts between 30 seconds and in my own studies, 45, 50 seconds. That's its duration. After that, it gets replaced by the next sound that's coming in, or just simply over time, it decays. So auditory short-term memory has really good fine details, but it doesn't last very long. And once it's gone, unless a sound has been stashed away in long-term storage, it's gone. Sounds that are stashed away in long-term storage, when you're recalling a mix you did, you're recalling in your head a song that you know really well, you're activating a pattern of neural activity that is a crude representation of the actual signal itself. Auditory, well, I should say that the people who work with sound, like us, tend to have enhanced auditory memory compared to people who do not work in sound. Musicians have better auditory memory than non-musicians do in general, but long-term memory, he's right, it's absolutely kind of crude. We're not remembering as much as we tell ourselves we are.
Well, and I think that, sorry, go ahead, Chad.
No, I was just going to say, because you mentioned A being, which I mean, that sounds like a different thing to me than the long or short-term memory.
So if you're let's say, all right, so you're A being two microphones. You've taken two microphones, you've put them on a guitar cabinet, and you're listening to one, and you're encoding it, and it's an active trace, and then you switch over, you listen to the second microphone, and you're making a comparison. You can do that in auditory short-term memory because microphone A is still in there. There's still something called perceptual fluency, meaning that the pattern of activity, it's still there. It remembers it.
But the thing is that I always found, because you mentioned fooling, we fool ourselves a lot. I think A being in lots of cases is fooling yourself a lot. I know you have to do it to a certain degree, but to put a lot of stock in it, I never did, because listening to A changes your ears. When you go to B, your ears have changed to acclimate to A. So you're not getting a really objective read of B. You're not getting the real B. If you had started with B, then you wouldn't get the real A.
That is so true. Yeah, that is so true.
So you really can't put a lot of stock in what you're doing unless you take the time. It's somewhat connected, but because a lot of people like to compare their mix to other. I know this is a little bit different, but for me, it has the same solution, is that when people are doing a mix, they ask if I put up other CDs and A/B, just to see if top to bottom, not comparing emotion, or I don't know how you do that really, because it's all one thing to me. So I can't do that, but that's what a lot of people do. I used to do it. I used to try, and it was always devastating every time if I get a mix up and then I put up my favorite sounding CD, and I just want to see if I'm in the same world sonically. It never worked because, well, besides the obvious thing of it not being the same song, the thing about your ears changing depending on what you're listening to. So for me, it's always a time-based thing. If you want to compare something, you've got to do it over a long period of time. You've got to listen to this one thing for like, a few minutes, and then stop, give yourself a second and listen to something else for a few minutes. Now maybe the memory thing, the long-term memory problem comes into there. With comparing mixes, for me, which is a little, I know I'm getting off on a little bit different of a thing here, but if you're comparing a CD to your mix, that never worked for me. But if I'm thinking that my A being is that I want to kind of match that CD in some way, that's what A being is, right? You're trying to see if you're in that ballpark of your favorite mixer. My solution was to go into the studio and play the CD at all, just like I was mixing it, play all the songs, play the whole CD, and levels up, levels down, like I would be when I'm mixing, and let your body acclimate to that, and then go back to your thing. Now bring up yours. Now your body is going to want to hear or feel what it just felt, and you have a better chance of sort of not copying, but you see. And now I don't know how that plays into long-term oral memory or what, but because it's a whole body experience, it's not just like I'm going to hear how something sounds with A being. Does 3K, is it hurting my ears at this level? Am I getting a little bit of discomfort with the 10K? Am I feeling the bass here? Am I feeling it lower? All that stuff comes into play with anything you're trying to compare. So I think you have to let your body acclimate and then go to the next thing. And, if you want to copy that thing, if you have a thing that you're looking at, that's what you want to achieve, then you can try to EQ or manipulate what you're working on to how your body feels. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, and you're talking about sensory systems adapt. I think food is a good analogy here. You take the first bite of something, and that's when you really notice the flavors. The second bite, the third bite, the fourth bite, by the time you get to that bottom of that bowl of soup, you're not tasting it with the same acuity you were when you took the first bite. So yeah, you're absolutely right. You adapt to it. And if you want to know if your soup has too much salt compared to another really good soup, you kind of probably need a palate cleanser. You need to eat a cracker or something like that, so that you would let your auditory system go back to its baseline state and then regard yours or regard the
Which
other
is also a lot to do with the brain being the prediction engine. It is trying to predict the future. So it wants the next bit of soup to taste like the first bit. So if it does, then it doesn't become a conscious thing about how it tastes because it's cool. So that way, when there's something weird in that next bite of soup, you actually will notice it and not be overwhelmed with all of the original flavors that you were tasting. One other thing I just wanted to mention, and it's not something I feel like I can explain well, but I didn't make this one up, but it's a thing, is that the perception of sound is very, very different to every other sense that we have, in that it only makes sense within a time window. Any other sense can take the full set of inputs that it's getting and create some sort of sensory perception from that. You can take one frame of a movie as a very bad way to explain it, but you can see everything there. It might take you a while to look around it, but it's all there all the time. Sound only makes sense in the context of what has happened before and what happens after, but your brain is creating a sense of the future and the past to understand the present. And that's a very, very different way than any other sense is processed, as far as I know. I don't know how relevant that is to anything, but it's fascinating to me that that's the way that works.
It's such a cool thing to think about. You're absolutely right there. And so in the first instant that we hear something, the brain has these simultaneous cues that it looks at, and it says, okay, think this is what's going to happen, but I'm not 100% sure. So I need to keep watching to see how sounds behave over time. It takes us 35 milliseconds to extract a pitch from a signal. That's why clicks don't have a pitch. They're too fast. You need at least 35 milliseconds for the repeating part of the waveform to cycle through. So you can go, okay, there's the pitch. It actually takes us 250 milliseconds to figure out how loud something is. It's called the multiple looks model. But 250 milliseconds is a fairly long time. Your brain is just watching that waveform go up, 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 and it's going, wait for it, wait for it, wait for it. And if that amplitude keeps going up, 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 it says, holy shit, this is really loud. And then it activates the acoustic reflex, which is ligaments attached to the bones of the middle ear. So the bones of the middle ear, they clamp down and they prevent the eardrum from extending too far forward or backward. Help protect your hearing. But it needs 250 milliseconds before it can make that decision. So a gunshot is going to happen too fast. You can't activate the acoustic reflex. A snare drum hit, a cymbal hit is going to cause damage because you haven't protected yourself.
And I suppose sorry, go ahead, Bella.
Sorry. But just on the subject of auditory memory, again, I don't know if it's something that's being studied, but I was really struck, and I keep on noticing how many voices we recognize, and how much voice recognition is an absolutely built-in skill that we all take for granted on a massive level. But of course we recognize the voices of those closest to us, or the people who we work with, or but just the degree to which you can tune in to the voices of people who are kind of you've met once, or you were once on a trip on, or there must be some sort of the evolutionary kind of reason for such acuity, and the fact that we are so good at kind of being able to kind of lock in different. I mean, I recognize this when I went to Antarctica, and I was on a ship with 120 people who were on there for just over 3 weeks. And by the end of that, and that including lots of people from, all different nationalities, so lots of people not speaking English. And by the end of the trip, it was just after I got my hearing back, and I could recognize pretty much every single voice on that ship. And that was not unusual, I don't think. I mean, that ability to kind of tune in really quickly to someone, as you say, Susan. I mean, we all kind of we tune and retune to kind of different voices and different sounds all the time. But I'm amazed and struck by how every time I turn on the radio, it might, it's a traffic announcement, or the kind of person who does the weather, or kind of whatever it is. It's like, oh, it's her or it's him, or kind of they're it's just a remarkable skill.
Well, and especially when the way you process the words they're saying is completely separate from their voices. The whole point is that the timbre means nothing. You recognize words in English no matter who's saying them, in what register, and even in what order, yet separately you classify the timbre of the voices. And I think you say that, maybe it's the same for everybody, but you'd just gotten your hearing back. I mean, to the second time we're bringing him up today, Stevie Wonder can recognize anybody he's ever met. And he obviously has a greater capacity for that than a lot of people. And some of that has to be because of how much more he relies on his auditory senses, I would think.
There's a great phrase, the human voice has been called our auditory face. And as you said at the beginning of our talk, Andrew, you said correctly that speech is the most important sound in our world. That's how we survived, is that capacity to recognize speech. So the shape of our pinna, our auditory cortex, the way it's organized, all of that is to help us process speech. And recognizing the sounds in someone's voice helped us to survive. It's such an interesting topic that when sound is coming in our 2 ears, as you said earlier, it's got 2 streams. We evolved to have these 2 streams. The one stream is dealing with the information. The other stream is dealing with the intonation or the emotion. So your brain is asking and answering the questions, what is it? Left hemisphere. What is it to me? Right hemisphere. And you're automatically going to split those 2 things off. When ancient human beings are out there and they're in the brush and they're grunting and moaning and causing all kinds of havoc with one another, they realize they can use their voices in 2 different ways. They can use their voices to send specific information, but they can also use their voices to broadcast what's going on with them, their feelings. And those 2 paths split off and developed from it. We got music and we got speech. Music is optimized for conveying emotion. Speech is optimized for information.
Awesome.
People, I think I'm going to disappear because I am fading fast. And I
Yes.
haven't had anything.
Yes, I think we'll probably wrap this up pretty soon. Thank you so much, Bella. Thanks for coming. It's amazing.
Thank you so much. It's been amazing. It's been completely amazing, and I will watch it back and marvel.
Nice to meet you.
Pleasure to meet you, Bella.
Nice to see you, Bella.
Yeah.
We'll talk soon, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely, we will. Okay.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye.
Cheers.
So should we
Okay.
just do a couple more?
Yeah. Let's see. Question from Daedalus. What is happening in your ears when you experience ear fatigue?
You're just running out of metabolites. You're physically exhausted. It's kind of the same thing that happens to your body when you jog. Your heart and lungs, you're sending oxygen, you're sending blood down to the muscles. But at some point, the body needs a break, and it says, I just got to stop for a few minutes before I continue on this run. And it's kind of the same thing with the auditory system. The hair cells, think about it, listening to 1K, and think about those hair cells firing a burst of nerve volleys, they're called, the action potentials, a burst of them 1,000 times a second. And that's just for 1K. The poor little thing, it gets tired and they stop every once in a while. And when they resume firing in phase. The whole system is phase locked. But at a certain point, you run out of metabolites and they need a little bit of a break. So it's common. Audio engineers will often, you guys can attest to this, we'll push through on sheer willpower and we'll tell ourselves that we know what we're hearing and that our hearing acuity is as sharp as ever. And we're kind of deceiving ourselves a little bit. We need those ear breaks.
Yeah, I learned early on, and it was because of, again, my partner Mitchell. He had pretty strict work hours, and I worked with a lot of different, mainly Mitchell, but I worked with other producers at the studio, and all other producers would, midnight would come around, and it would be working on one part or something, and we just couldn't get it, or couldn't figure out the sound that would fit in the track, or whatever it was. And they wouldn't let it go. It was like, no, we got to get it before we leave. All those sessions that I ever did like that, we always redid what we did that late at night. We had to redo it the next day. All the sessions with Mitchell, where we stopped at 7 or 8 in the evening after really only working 8 hours of the day. If we got in there at 10 or something, we took lots of breaks. I don't recall doing anything or redoing very much ever the next day. It's always, we got it that day. So I think it's really important not to push yourself too much. I know it's hard with a musician because that's a different, as for an engineer, it's, you don't want to push, but for a musician, sometimes that thing of going late and getting to another state of mind is a good thing. So I don't know, it's a weird balance, isn't it, for that?
Yeah, but the fatigue is actual physical fatigue, both in your
It is,
brain
yeah.
and in your ears. Everything takes chemicals, and they need to be flushed out. There's waste product from all the chemical reactions, and you got to have a sandwich. You got to sleep. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. That one feels like a bigger topic, but we should do another one. Okay. Let me just find one last cool one for us. Okay. Let's do two if you're okay with it, because I think that they can both be pretty short answers.
Sure.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so Adrian asks, what's the story on the gummies? Yay or nay? They're tinnitus gummy. It sounds like vitamin supplements or something. So we can generalize this and just say vitamin supplements for treating tinnitus. Says he always sees them advertised on Facebook or Instagram.
I don't know about I don't know specifically about those things, but I was just reading recently. I did a little bit of reading on the most recent research to help me be informed for this podcast, and I was reading that certain vitamins do help. A, C, E, antioxidants help. So, yeah, I wouldn't say everything and could help.
What I'm not even sure what they are, but I had read that bioflavonoids help.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what that is.
I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
And I'm selling them right here.
Yeah, so yeah. ChadBlake.com.
Chad's riboflavonoids.
One more, CoQ10. That was another one that helps the auditory system. CoQ10. I think it helps with circulation in general, if I recall.
Mm-hmm. I got something that was it was a product that was specifically advertising like that it was useful for treating tinnitus, and
is that a ShamWow
supplement? I think it was a ShamWow. It was really good for cleaning out my ears now. It was riboflavonoids, I think, and as far as like how well it worked, I got it because I was having that thing I was talking about where my ear was closing, and it was before the lockdown. I was doing a lot of very, very long days, and I was using it, and then I wasn't using it because I was forgetting about it. And for myself, that's usually because the problem goes away. So I stopped thinking about taking the thing. Yeah. I don't know, effective or not if it was.
I think
honestly, I can't really say.
What Susan said earlier is really important. Talking about, the clinical treatments that have been done, everybody's reaction to them is different, and most likely partially because the cause of everybody's problems are slightly different and everybody's metabolism is different. So it could be that the tinnitus gummy bears are the best thing ever for like 7 people.
Yeah.
And then won't do anything except make you eat a bunch of animal fat.
And for some people, the green ones won't do anything.
No.
But the red ones will do everything.
But if they're like most gummy bears, if you bite their heads off, then they're little tables. And it's nice to make 4 of them sit around a little gummy bear torso table. Okay, last question.
Awesome.
Last question.
All right. And that's the sign for the last question.
Yeah.
Okay. This one is from Larry Hins. And he says, on the subject of using a hearing aid, is the added acoustic energy presented by the device dangerous to your remaining hearing?
I wish I could answer that in a knowledgeable way, but any audiologist who's fitting you for a hearing aid is going to know that. And I'm sure they're going to help you dial in that hearing aid so that it boosts in the region where you need frequencies boosted. For my friend Tommy, like a lot of musicians and like a lot of people, it was that 1K to 4K region. He really had a tough time understanding speech, and his hearing aid boosts just that region. It's not bothering the other regions as far as I can tell. So I think that'd be a question for your audiologist, but it's a good question.
Mm.
Et voila. I think that brings us to the end of the Hearing Summit. This has been incredible. Thank you so much, Tchad. Thanks, Susan, for coming.
And
Mark,
can I just add just a post note
anything
here?
you want.
And it's mainly for the mixers out there, because that's what I do, and it's sort of my interest in with everything that we've talked about, in trying to alleviate the fear of speaking out and the fear of doing the job that you might really want to do. I'd venture to say that probably 98% of people with hearing trouble who are trying to be a mixer, if your mixes aren't coming out very good, it's not your hearing. It means you need to practice more.
Yeah.
Andrew and I have been mixing for so many years, and I'll tell you what, we didn't mix good to begin with, I'm sure.
I still don't.
That's not true. I went through years and years of shitty mixing, and it's only through the perseverance of doing it that I've gotten somewhere. And I went through all the things that I hear of fear that my ears were never going to let me be a mixer, because I got tested and I saw what the problem was, and that my curves were terrible, and I blamed that for a long time on I can't do the job. And it's taken me years to learn that that's not right. There's no excuse. There really isn't an excuse for, I'd say, 98% of the people.
Yeah.
There may be another 2% that have some really severe trouble, but even that severity could give you an edge in some little corner of the music business to do something really special. So that shouldn't hinder you.
Yeah, your hearing health is super important, and you need to take care of it, and you need to be aware of it. But in terms of its application to whether or not you can mix, it's in exactly the same category as to whether you own a certain piece of gear or a plugin.
Yeah.
It just doesn't matter.
Just get on with it and practice.
Yeah, but also know that you're not the only one. And I think that, for me, that was the real hope for doing this, is that there would be at least 20 people who would say, oh, I'm not the only one, and you can talk about it now. And it's doesn't have the same stigma.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Tchad. Definitely.
Yeah,
any parting
Tchad,
thoughts,
so
Susan?
correct. I was just going to say that is 100% correct. It takes years to learn to be a good mixer. It takes years to master that craft. If you're not getting it in the first couple of years, maybe you're on your way to becoming a great mixer, because none of us got it in the first couple of years.
Yeah.
It takes a long, long time.
I'm still working on it.
Yeah. Now, there are some people who seem to come from the womb fully formed with it. And as a preview for next week, as Ed Stasium called him, Bobby Clearmountain will be my guest next week. So he's a guy who seemed to do pretty well pretty early, but we're going to find out how many years it took him to get there, because, even Bob, or Mr. Clearmountain, as I will call him.
He's the master. He's the master man.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Amazing. Thank you so much, Mark. Thanks for moderating, as always.
Thanks, Mark.
Incredible.
It's lovely to
be
see
here
you,
with you guys.
Susan.
Thank you so much.
Lovely to see you too, Chad.
And Wendy has sent her love right here to everybody, actually, but to you
she said all
especially.
of her favorite peeps, even you, Mark.
All of her favorite peeps, yeah.
Love her so much.
Yeah, me too. And thank you, Andrew, for having me. This is lovely.
Of course, my pleasure. My pleasure.
Andrew, I hope we could do something like this at an AES sometime, because the AES needs to be talking about this.
Anytime.
It needs to be out in public.
Absolutely.
Anytime. It's a very special topic to push, and I'm anytime you want to do it, let me know.
Great. And you know people over there, so just send them a link to this. It's on YouTube as soon as I hit stop. So yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Guys, on behalf of the chat room, everybody is thanking you guys profusely, and especially for being bold enough to come out and talk about it. And that it just took some balls. So
well,
thank you guys.
Considering that Chad and I will never work again, we'll come to you looking for the handouts. You have what? All right. Okay, so now we'll all wave awkwardly. I'll mute the mic and we'll go to the thanks for watching screen because that's what we do.
All right.